Hello, everyone. Welcome to another PodCAP episode. It's been a little bit since we've done our last PodCAP, and it might look a little different than usual, but I'm Voltage. I'm the current host of PodCAP. I've been playing Cap since, I think, Gen 7. My first process was for the starters, where I really got involved, and then I was eventually on the topic leadership team for Miasma for the abilities. And I've participated in a couple different Cap things, done some team tournaments, been a regular contributor, and I'm excited today to guide our discussion on the concepts for Cap 33. And I'm joined today by a couple lovely individuals. We'll start down the list. quziel, feel free to introduce yourself.
Hey, quziel. I'm one of the Cap moderators, focusing mainly on metagame and process elements of the project. And I've been on the TLT a couple times. I joined, I think, probably around the same time Voltage did. Yeah.
Awesome. And Scizivire?
Yes, hi, my name is Scizivire. I've been involved with Cap since about Jumbao, I would say. Though I've been lurking for a lot longer. You might know me from bangers such as the Cap 32 Hemogoblins ability stage, and I'm currently on the TLT as the move pool leader, or the moves leader for Cap 33.
Nice. So today in this PodCAP, we'll be going through concept submissions this early stage of Cap 33, the first part, probably my favorite part, honestly. Concepts have been open since Monday, August 6th, I think it was. 7th, excuse me, and today is Saturday, August 12th, 2023, so I'm officially dating this PodCap, if you will. So we're going to go through most of the concepts that have been submitted up to this point. Concepts after this PodCap goes out, unfortunately, we won't be able to cover in depth, but we wanted to talk in particular just about concepts and what we look at and look for in them when we consider how we vote for a Cap concept. Because for those of you who might not know, this is sort of the guiding framework that we use in order to guide this whole project. The whole idea stems around how we address the concept that's pitched to us. And so the idea is that a bunch of users will be able to submit a concept of some kind, and it'll have a name, it'll have sort of a description, and in these first, you try to get really to the point. The name is, you get a little creative, but not overly so. You should be able to, in like a few words, what is the point of this concept? And then a description is sort of like, in 3 sentences, what is this concept? So even a little bit more in detail. And then the next step is sort of that justification, like, why are we going to do this? What are we going to explore? How are we going to explore it, perhaps? Why it's a worthwhile process to explore, how it might impact the metagame around us. And for reference, the metagame that Cap builds around is technically supposed to be the OU, the Smogon OU metagame. However, we do sort of keep in mind Cap threats as well. But we primarily build for a 6v6 singles metagame. So we're asking ourselves, how would this process impact the current metagame that we see in our play? And then there are some questions about the process, and these questions are really these guiding ideas that bring us through the concept that's being pitched. So these questions are questions that we hope to answer as we go through a Cap process. And these get pretty fun. These are more like ideas that we could explore as we do them. And they are they're interesting to explore, and they can be very varied and interesting, and I like them a lot. It's probably my favorite part of a pitch in a process, because you get to see the creativity behind it. And then lastly, there's the explanation, where you can just sort of like eschew the elevator pitch and just sort of explain where you got the idea, what you think an example of it might look like in real life. And when I say real life, I mean like in existing metagames. You can change this process too, because the explanation is non-binding. Future polls do not have to adhere to the explanation process, though it might be tempting to do so, but in general, the explanation should not be the binding factor. The binding factors are everything before that. And so when we think about good concepts, a good concept is like pure utility, or status counter, or like momentum, like something that abuses momentum in a play. Whereas bad concepts are ones that generally lock down the process in some way without a pull. So these might be like ice-resisting dragon, because that locks down the typing of the process. Same thing with like a flavor-based one, like a pyrokinetic Pokemon making it fire psychic. That immediately reduces any typing staging, which doesn't really help us. Another one that we typically try to avoid in here are the ideas of frameworks. And the idea that a framework is that it's an entirely flavor-based design, like starters, legendaries, not fully evolved Pokemon, things like that. So essentially with these concepts, we want to make sure that we're getting to the point, not overly restricting ourselves, and making decisions from a competitive perspective, not from a flavor perspective. As much as we'd love to make that Route 1 Pokemon, Cap is fundamentally a competitive process. So, with that, do you have any thoughts you want to add to that?
Yeah. It's worth noting that every Cap has to have a typing, ability, stats, and move stage. So any concept that explicitly sets in stone or heavily limits one of those stages is sort of inherently illegal. Again, ice-resisting dragon, it doesn't fully set the typing stage in stone, but it basically says you have to be a dragon type with a secondary typing that is resistant to ice, and then your ability has to provide another resist to ice. So you're basically setting typing down to maybe 4 options, and ability is set down to 1 option. Yeah. So that's sort of inherently illegal, and would basically just say, hey, I know we have someone with leading ability stage, they can just take a vacation, which we don't want to do, because we did elect 4 people to lead the project, so we can't just tell one of them that they aren't actually doing anything.
Right, exactly. And I think as well, when it comes to processes, the best kind of pitches or concepts to submit for a CAP process are the ones that give us options and paths to go down while not just giving us an open field, Ideally, we want there to be some inclination of a path, but not one that's immediately paved down saying this is what we're doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, some of the more difficult caps to run are those which can leave it a bit too open. I think that was one of the criticisms of Hemogoblin's process, was beyond just having mediocre stats, we didn't really have any direction to go by. And that sort of led the process to be floundering in a lot of places where we just sort of didn't know what we wanted to do.
Yeah. And
that made it really difficult to make any kind of informed choices.
Yeah. For reference, Hemogoblin's concept was the concept bang average, where the idea was to make a competitively viable Pokemon that had quote-unquote average stats. And so some of those questions that we explored were, what was the concept of average? Did it mean we had like an outlier and then the rest of the stats were low? Or were all the stats, sub 100 base, for example? So that was the previous process. So now we're sort of in this new stage. Ciz, do you have anything that you wanted to add related to concepts and their general concept?
No. I think you got it down perfectly, actually.
All right. So then let's move right along. So as we mentioned, there's the TL and the TLT, the topic leader and the topic leadership team. So in this case, Ozma, who is one of the OU forum heads and members of Big Stall, is leading this concept. And she's done a really good job at making it very clear what her view of a good CAP process is going to look like. We won't go too much into this right now, just because, that's a whole PodCAP in and of itself, what it's like to be a TL and on the TLT, for example. But I think Ozma does a really good job here expressing what she is looking for with regards to concepts that she will slate. For reference, the topic leader is allowed to make a slate of all the concepts that they believe will make for appropriate and interesting processes. So they're sort of like the project leader on this thing, and then each TLT leader is like the subsection or the stage leader, if that makes sense. Where Ozma is overseeing everything else, and Scizivire is on charge of moves for this process, which is a few steps down the road. So, again, Ozma's looking for concepts that have clearly outlined and engaging parameters for its suggested design space. And they're looking specifically for, like, a concept that balances feasibility, inspiration, and ambition. So that's sort of like a good creative push for users to give something that they believe will make for a meaningful process. And I think, unless either of you have any things you want to bring up, I'm down to move on to sort of the first one that's presented here in the thread.
Feel free.
Let's get into some concepts.
All right. So the first one we've got here is Explosion Badger's Schrodinger's Cap. And I guess before we get too deep into this, I want to make it very clear for people submitting or who might want to submit in a future CAP process that we are trying to be very constructively criticism here. We're not trying to make this sort of a, like, oh, your concept sucks. We want to be very objective about this. So if we do criticize your concept and you are listening, we hope that it's done in a constructive manner and it does not come across as a personal attack. So the first cap concept here is Schrodinger's Cap. This is a concept that has the Pokemon's abilities change the effect of a move / what moves can be used, thus changing the Pokemon's role and what team comps it succeeds on, like team compositions. And so what Explosion Badger is getting here is this idea of, like, role diversity in Cap. Can either of you sort of speak to, like, role diversity, what that looks like in Cap, and sort of your thoughts on this concept at all?
So I guess my feeling on this concept is the central thrust is that we should have a basic chassis, a move full stats typing, such that the choice of ability generally will change how you respond to it and how you play with it fairly dramatically. A less major version of this would be, think of Greninja, which the choice of Protean versus Battle Bond will generally change what bonds you bring in against it. And
Gen 7
also,
Greninja, right?
Even current gen, in both cases, if it reveals Battle Bond, you're suddenly trying to prevent it from getting a kill ever during the game. Because you know that if you fail to do that, it's going to go out of control. Versus Protean, you could be a bit more lackluster. You can afford to sack stuff to it in order to revenge kill it. You just have a bit more space.
I feel like that's true. And then also with that Protean Greninja, you have to be a lot more concerned about specific moves that it's using. Because Battle Bond Greninja, at least when I think about it back in Gen 7, the idea was that Battle Bond Greninja usually ran something to the effect of, like, Hydro Pump, Dark Pulse, Water Shuriken, and what was that fourth move it usually goes? Sorry? Spikes, yeah. So, like, with that's pretty consistent with the 4 moves it's going to be bringing, and you only have to really worry about water and dark coverage, but you have to worry about, the priority water attack, etc. Whereas with, like, Protean Greninja, that could be Choice Scarf, that could be, like, Z-Dig, as janky as that was at the time. It could have Gunk Shot, it could have Ice Beam, it could have Hidden Power Fire. It could have just so many... Sorry?
Dash.
Yeah.
The Sash League set as well.
Yeah, that's true. The T-Spikes and Spikes one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, sort of the contrast between it's going to get a lot of the work done right now versus a sort of longer, slower approach with, as much as you can call it slower, but, Battle Bond, where you're aiming to play for 20 turns down the line, where it just wins the game because it got a single kill.
Yeah, and Badger brings that up here, Pokemon like Greninja who use Protean. We discussed a little bit about this in the CAP Discord server, which, if you want to talk about CAP in an informal setting, you can join the CAP Discord server, by the way. But I think one of my main gripes with this one in particular is that it feels like we would just end up making two completely different mons, and it feels like it's very, very possible to lose sight of, like, one versus the other. That's kind of my initial thought with this. And I feel like this is a question that does get asked a little bit, like, can both roles be offensive or both be defense and have enough difference between the two? Or is one more offensive, one more defensive, excuse me. You know, it's just like, I don't feel like this is... I feel like it's almost too nebulous, too gaseous, if that makes sense.
I almost have the opposite criticism, that I think because they want two very different roles, I think it almost just forces us to be incredibly careful with our ability choice.
I think it's worth mentioning that Badger is explicitly stating that it should use similar moves, or at least, same or similar moves.
Yeah, that's good.
On the different abilities, but the ability will change what these moves do. So
that's a good point.
I think he gives the example of having a Mon with Serene Grace and Sheer Force, which both these abilities interact with secondary effects of moves, but they do this in a different way. And I think this is potentially really restricting. Like, we are making one Mon, basically, and it will click the same moves, obviously, and then you have to just choose how to respond, but it may just be another ability, you know?
Yeah. I think that's a good point too, because inherently, if you think about, like, if you were to look at Nidoking's move pool, right? And you think about Sheer Force versus Serene Grace on, like, Flamethrower, Ice Beam, and Earth Power. I think that that is a really good way to demonstrate, like, as a, what's the word I'm looking for here? Sort of an example, or like a hypothetical here. And I feel like that one definitely has to be better than the other, right? Like, in my opinion, Sheer Force, you know what you're getting every time. Serene Grace is still very RNG-based, and in my opinion, like, you're gonna want to pick the one that has a more consistent outcome, right? Like, you don't want to expect a 20% burn versus a 10% burn from Flamethrower.
Yeah, I think we'd have to be incredibly careful on both what moves, what abilities we're focusing on, because I guess I just wonder, if we end up with a Mon that runs ability 1 95% of the time in higher levels of play, is that a failure of the concept? And I think that's something that, you know, just because of how much people optimize stuff, I think that's very, very likely to happen, unless we are perfect with our ability choice.
Yeah, and I think, you know...
I agree.
I think Badger also brings up the concept of Equilibra, which, you know, Bulletproof versus Levitate, which is something that is valid initially, but Bulletproof versus Levitate doesn't change the way that Equilibra's moves work. It's just a way of how the player responds to it. So I think Badger's trying to take it one step further with this Bulletproof versus Levitate, and I almost worry, too, that it might get a little centralizing in the sense that if you have to guess what it is just based on the move, like, you know, Sheer Force versus Serene Grace, you might be able to figure it out via calculator, for example, but, like, let's say this Pokemon gets a move as well as its, like, 4th coverage slot, something like Spikes, for example, right? You still wouldn't know what ability it's running, but it's gonna probably run the same moveset. Then you have to sort of account for, like, the mind game of it as well when you're in fights. And while that shouldn't, like, influence the direct reason of why you do a process, I feel like the nuance behind creating a process of a Pokemon that does that, it requires a lot of it, you know? So I worry that Cap, as much as I trust the Cap process, sometimes it could get to be very, very messy if we're not very careful with this, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I think it's a fine process that could lead to a fine outcome. I just think it's also a very difficult process to sort of thread the needle of, correct move choice, correct ability choice, having both of them viable. I think that's like 3 things where it can be very difficult, and it may just be, DLC is coming out soon. That would be another one of my worries, like, what if the abilities we choose aren't reliable in the post-DLC meta? I guess that's my thing. It's like, no shade on the cap, I just think that it could be a very difficult thing to thread that needle.
Yeah, I think most of all, this concept I think would work, but it's indeed very difficult to execute it like in a viable way.
I agree. I think the landing pad for this, sort of what Q's said before, like, would this be successful if they're using one ability 95% of the time? That needle's eye, or like the target landing pad, or like ways that we can define success for this concept are really slow, or really small, excuse me. There's like, it's really hard to get a clearly defined successful definition of what is a successful process, if that makes sense. So, that's all we'll talk about for this one, unless anyone else has any other things they want to bring up about this.
Let's move on.
All right.
Unless you said something.
All right. Next one is Amamama's The Pawn. This Pokemon seeks to recreate parts of the gameplay of the chess pawn in Pokemon. We will incorporate its 3 most distinguishable aspects. It is a piece that opens the game. 2, it is a piece that, despite being able to only achieve slow incremental progress, is crucial for positioning the team for success through its defense utility and its ability to pressure the opponent offensively. And 3, it is a piece that ultimately is expendable compared to the other team members in a lot of games and might be sacked for the sake of the team, or even traded to be replaced by a previously lost teammate. So, I have thoughts about this, but I'll let you two open up because, White to move first, right?
I think the concept of chess in Pokemon is very interesting, first of all.
Very analogous.
Yeah. Like, currently we have King Gambit, which is kind of based on the King piece, as it should. And then the basic game plan you have for King Gambit teams is you sacrifice other members of the team so that the king, can survive and then potentially sweep. And then
get that checkmate.
I think what Amama is trying to do here is exactly the opposite, where we create a Pokemon that will be sacrificed or set up a game state in which other Pokemon can thrive and open up games that way, pretty much.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it makes for a really interesting way of observing, like, what parts of play things are able to accomplish. Like, in the opening parts of a game, when you think of, like, hyper offense with Dragapult screens, Dragapult goes in at the start of the game, sets up screens, maybe clicks curse and faints, and then you get your next person in with, like, screens. Or if you manage to find a way to take Dragapult out and save it a little bit, it can come back in later and set up screens again, Like, that is something that could be crucial to positioning the team, albeit maybe not exactly through defensive utility, but providing down the line defensive utility, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily limited to hyper options anyway.
Yeah.
A lot of teams will make use of a hazard lead, for example, or certain defensive answers to Pokemon that are commonly seen in earlier stage of play, which can be sacrificed later on if the thing they're supposed to answer is no longer alive or simply not on the opposing team.
Yeah, I think about in like stall, like Toxapex, for example, especially in previous gens, where like
Yeah.
you come in, knock, and then leave, or come in, set up spikes, take a hit, and then leave, and then the Pex, once, you know, the threat that Pex is checking is dead, well, now Pex can sort of just like die, you know?
Yes.
I think, in terms of like the concept, I think this is just one of those where there's a lot of different ways to read the concept, and I don't necessarily know if that helps it, because I think it's very easy
all these
for a
questions.
lot of different people to have a lot of different reads of the concept. You know, do you focus on the aspect of, you know, promoting a pawn to a queen? Is that the central part of this concept? It's mentioned there. Is it about controlling space? Is it about early game versus late game pressure? And I think that's my main criticism of it, is that it's I think it would lead to a very difficult process, because I think you'd have people arguing very different points based on their interpretation of the concept, unless we have a very strong conclusion to the concept assessment.
Yeah.
We would get a lot of just different stages where people would be arguing completely different visions of the cap, even more so than usual, just because it's a sort of very high level concept.
I agree. I think you've touched upon what I think my biggest criticism is of this concept, is that it's trying to do too much. And I think emulating a pawn is really good. I think it's a great idea. The problem is, like, it opens the game, it achieves slow incremental progress, and then it's expendable. So, but then, you know, we talk about down here the idea of promotion, and I think another thing, this would really, really benefit from, like, being narrowed down. If they picked 2 of these 3, I think it would be a lot safer and still very interesting of a process to do. There are 21 questions to be answered in this. I would love, like, and my ADHD brain is, like, seeing these words and, like, I can't read any of them, you know? I don't know.
I relate.
It's just like, there's so much to take in and ask ourselves questions. Like, half of these questions would still be plenty of questions. So I would love to see this concept be just, like, chopped down a little bit, you know? Like, you could easily pull 2 concepts out of this, maybe even 3. If you think about, like, the 3 things that it wants to do, you could do, like, a combination of 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 1 and 3. You know, like that, all of those would make for really interesting concepts. So I think my opinion is that this should just be reduced a little bit.
I agree. Yeah, I think if they make this concept a little bit more compact, it would do well in the polls, I would think.
I agree.
Because it's such an interesting way to go about thinking about a Pokemon game in chess terms. And even if this concept doesn't necessarily do that well this time, I think AMA should definitely hold on to it for maybe future caps as well.
Definitely. And I think there is a lot of merit to have a concept that is very easily understood just from, like, its name and its identity. Because people know what pawns do in chess. Like, this is something that is such a transferable knowledge idea that this is what it does. We want to make a Pokemon that does this. So I get the idea of wanting to do that. So I think if it's just boiled down a little bit, this could easily be, like, a winning cap process. Any other thoughts, Q's?
I guess my thing is also just, like, I'll be frank, I'm not good enough at chess.
Yeah.
I think that's just one of the main issues, is that, like, chess is such an absurdly deep and, you know, big
Timeless.
game that, like, I feel like it just suffers from the fact that, like, almost no one in the cap process is going to be big enough at chess to, like, really tackle this well. I guess that's my main issue with it, is just, like, chess is really difficult. I'm not good. I don't play chess.
Yellow.
I don't really know how to evaluate it is just my main thing.
Yeah. Will this cap be able to en
same here.
passant? I don't know. Who knows? Otherwise, y'all good to move on to reconnaissance?
Yep.
All right. Up by Swiftix, Reconnaissance, this Pokemon's main role will be to assess and report. In other words, it excels at scouting opposing sets to determine the best counter for your team that your team has for it, thus generating momentum through information and subsequent positioning. And they bring it up very quickly here that this concept is very similar to Kitsuno, the existing cap Kitsuno, which is a ghost steel type that was made in Gen 4 that was designed to do exactly that. And one of the questions that they do bring up is how has that changed? I believe that is something that they had. No, we talked about it in the Discord. We talked about one of the things I really wanted to have them ask as well was like, how would this concept be different from Kitsuno? And I think that's my main question that I'd love to see them expand upon in this pitch, just because I think it's a really important thing to ask ourselves. How has this idea of, like, a gameplay action changed over the course of multiple generations?
Yeah, I think, obviously, you can bring in preview. That's the biggest thing.
Right.
Before preview, you needed a scout because you needed to figure out, like, hey, they have 5 slots I've not seen. What is in those 5 slots? So having a moderately bulky, relatively fast one that has moderate offensive presence and is sort of okay at forcing switches and can use U-turn. That's a great scout because forces are reasonably good at forcing a defensive response and it can just get out of there. But in the Age of Team preview, where I think it's a lot easier to sort of suss out both like set choices, mon choices, item choices from league matchup, it does become a bit more difficult. I think probably the most natural is like, hey, can you scout their Terra choice?
Yeah.
And they do bring that up.
They do. But I think, too, like, the idea of, like, figuring out what set is Iron Valiant, for example, right? Like, what is Iron Valiant's? Is it physical? Is it special? What's its coverage, for example? Is the Great Tusk running certain things, or is it not? Just, there is... This process fundamentally comes down to what information you can get just by looking at a team, and what information you have to be able to suss out from a gameplay perspective. It's like, how do you know what you know when you play a match, if that makes sense? And I think that this process ideally makes it easier for you to figure out what it is you know that you can't get from a team preview.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think it's a bit more difficult to scout in the true sense of the word in this generation. However, I think there are some options to be explored. For example, there's a lot of Paradox Pokemon running Booster Energy, and they may vary which stat is boosted based on their set.
Yeah,
I think this is something we can potentially lean into, like make certain Paradox Pokemon want to switch in, force their booster energy,
or lack thereof,
then get out. Yeah.
I mean, even just like whirlwinding them in and just like seeing if they're booster or not is a form of scouting.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's true.
Yeah, the idea of just like, how do you generate knowledge about your opponent's team? I think that that's a really, really interesting concept to explore, especially in this metagame where, like, we already know all 6 Pokemon on the field, and you can kind of get an idea of, like, what they'll probably have. So I think that this concept, all things considered, is really interesting to me. I like it. I want to see them talk about it a little bit more, but otherwise, like, I think that this would allow for a really interesting concept. Or process, excuse me.
Yeah, I guess the other thing is, like, I feel like this might just, like, have sort of the same issue as the previous one, where reconnaissance is obviously, like, a very useful thing to have on a team, but I feel like it's one of those where, like, it can be a bit subtle and difficult to read what makes a good reconnaissance on.
Mm-hmm.
In that, is it regen user? Is that the only? Is like that's the most common way to use scout sets. It's just like pivot apex in.
Yeah.
So I think getting beyond that is going to be like one of the difficulties of the process. Is just like what ways can you recon a team without just like pivoting a regen on it and just scouting?
Yeah. How do you make it not be like cloaking? So, I think that there's room to work. I think the outcome, if you can, get past the regenerator idea potentially, I think that's like the low-hanging fruit. But I'm excited by this one. I think a little bit. So, moving on, if you all are okay with that. Pipachi's Wind-Up Soldier. This Pokemon becomes uniquely boosted by the actions of its teammates. So this Pokemon will explore a specific form of team support or game plan, which will directly interact with this Mon's abilities or moves. That allows its teammates to set it up to be stronger in more than one or multiple ways. So what do you all think about this one?
I am a little bit confused on how to make this work. I think the basic idea is something that we do not really see as much besides like screens. However, going like deeper into this is a bit vague for me, personally.
Yeah, I would love to know if, like, you're necessarily directly boosting your teammate, or if it's, like, negatively boosting opponents. Like, are you using Memento by your teammates to get this Pokemon in so that it just has a natural, like, way of attacking? Or are you using, like, Healing Wish or something, you know what I mean? Like, where Healing Wish gives it a second shot at getting things in. Or are you, like, making this a Grassy Seed, Psychic Seed user with Unburden, for example? Like, are you just making Halucha? It's weird. I don't know how this would be done.
I think this sort of has a common misstep that a lot of caps fall into, where there's a route that's very easy, very straightforward, which is, Rain, Weather Abuser, maybe just light screens abuser. And then there's more like high concept, high level, like more difficult routes, like, I think Pip brought up Heatwave plus Bolt Beak abuser in the Discord today. And I know that Cap, as a project, typically likes to avoid the quote-unquote obvious routes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's my main criticism here, because I think the obvious routes are, probably the ones where we can have the best exploration of the concept. And I just worry that, because Cap loves to sort of be contrarian in a lot of ways, we might get ourselves, sort of all mixed up and sort of in a more difficult place than we necessarily need to. And that might just make the concept more difficult, less user-friendly, and just less satisfying to make compared to, let's just make the best Swift Swimmer Sandrush user that's ever existed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of the more obvious ways to do this project, an example, weather, these things are pretty well explored, actually, not just in OU, also in lower tiers as well.
Yeah.
Where, weather setting abilities are not banned. Even Uber's other meta games, past gens, I think this has been done like pretty much everywhere, and I'm not sure if we can learn something from this concept.
Yeah.
It hasn't already been done.
Yeah, I'm especially interested in seeing, like, does this Pokemon need boosting from its teammates to work in general, or can it boost itself too? Because if it's not able to boost itself, that's way more interesting. It's like Kingambit without Swords Dance, if that makes sense. That could be interesting to me, you know? If it's only using Supreme Overlord as its, like, primary way of boosting. That, to me, feels like a way that could go. But I feel like a lot of these concepts lately all want to play with Supreme Overlord. So, I'm curious to see how that works in the grand scheme of things. But ultimately, yeah, I think you all kind of said my thoughts as well. Like, I don't know necessarily if this goes beyond, like, a terrain weather trick room abuser. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, Pip mentions...
Absolutely does go beyond that. I just worry that the search for ways to go beyond that might be a very difficult discussion to have. And I think that's
a good way of putting it. Yeah.
You know, like, again, obviously we can't just, you know, make it a bomb that needs the entire enemy team paralyzed to work. It seems difficult, and I just worry that we're going to try to make it even more difficult on ourselves just because we don't want to go for the obvious route.
Agreed. Any other thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, Pip mentions months like Ashgren and Dragapult as more interesting ways to complete the concept via prior damage or status.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a way that we could go. However, compared to like the more obvious routes, this will be pretty hard to do, I think. So pretty much what Q said just now, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. Okay, so let's move on then to Debuff Specialist by Noah IOTJ. This Pokemon excels at debuffing the enemy team through whatever means available. Very short post, but not a bad thing. You know, it's probably going to be expanded upon a little bit, I'd have to guess, but like, he sort of says, this one's sort of a mirror world version of Astrolottl's concept, whereas Astro was meant to be offensive cleric to directly assist its teammates. This concept seeks to focus on status and stat drops inflicted onto the opponent to be indirect team support. And I like that. I think it's cool. I'm a little biased because Astro's concept was mine, but I think this is a really cool inverse exploration that I think does have legs. Maybe whatever means available, I think needs to be, like, narrowed down just a little bit, but, you know, like, the idea of status, the idea of, like, debuffs, the idea of, like, making your opponent worse off, but not necessarily through damage, is a really interesting one to me.
I think there's definitely a lot of design space here. Sorry, I feel like I'm always starting off with criticism, but my one worry here is that I feel like a lot of the design space has sort of been tackled directly or indirectly with past concepts. Like, you know, Parting Shot is a very obvious route here, but we've done Parting Shot before.
Mm-hmm. With Kerfluffle.
As much Astro was brought up in the concept, but, you know, it's one of its strongest traits is just, you know, Fire Lash.
Yeah.
And I guess that, and like, it runs T-Wave as well, sometimes, not very often. But I guess that's my sort of feedback is, I think it's a very valid concept, and I think there's definitely a lot of options that haven't been explored. I think, you know, one of the big ones is, you know, basically any offensive move that lowers their power. We haven't really touched that as much.
Yeah.
I think our only mystical fire user was Queen or Omicron.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think moves like that, you know, very unexplored ground and cap. But yeah, I think my only real criticism is that, like, I think the most obvious routes are sort of already done.
I completely agree with what quziel is saying.
Yeah, I think that, like, if we can find new ways to explore this concept, it would be really interesting too. It's, again, I think you two both bring up very good points, though. The idea that Astro kind of covers this, we've seen it with Kerfluffle. Even with, to some effect, yeah, I know they bring up Tomahawk here as well, and the idea of, like, Tomahawk initially having Prankster and Intimidate, I think it was, right? Were its two abilities? Yeah. So, like, we've seen debuffs to some effect, but I think if we really, really lean into the idea of, like, how does debuffing your opponent lead to momentum in your favor, that could be something interesting to explore, in my opinion. I think I like this one more than you both, but I think that's just a personal take.
Yeah, again, for me, it's really just, like, debuffs to support your team is Parting Shot, and we had an entire concept around that. That's, like, my only real criticism here. It's a good concept. It's just, I think, by far, like, the most direct route available is something that we've already done.
Yep.
Okay.
I agree.
Well, then we'll move next to A Crusher King's Create a Parasite. This Pokemon gets stronger through the opponent's actions, such as by taking damage, stealing benefits, and or exploiting certain playstyles. I know that he name drops Marshadow kind of in the pitch somewhere that I can't find immediately with, the Spectral Thief. Yeah, and then there's like Mirror Herb or Defiant Competitive. I don't know how I feel about this one. I don't know.
I think there was a pretty similar concept later. I can't quite remember.
Yes, there is.
Okay. I do think, like, a mon that sort of implicitly closes out options by just being present, which really is what this is doing, If we made a really strong, like, prankster transform user, I'm not saying we should, but, just to bring up one example, that sort of basically says you can't set up for the next few turns, or until it's weakened. And I think that kind of team support by threatening to steal their actions or benefit from their actions is a really cool idea.
Yes.
I do sort of wonder if the scope of this is a bit too restricted. I'm thinking of, like, again, I love bringing up Balloon Heatran from last gen with Eruption, but
yeah,
I wonder if that, for example, is like a legal or like a end product that we'd be happy with.
Can you elaborate on how that would be?
Yeah, sure. Like, if you use a fire move when there's a Balloon Heatran on the opposing team, you have to make that really big calculus of, like, is it worth potentially just having your entire team just get eruptioned, to death? If you're facing a Ferrothorn, like, are you gonna be willing to click Flamethrower? Or there's a Heatran in the back? Maybe not. And I just don't know if, like, that particular route, where you're closing out options by potentially, having that type of power theft is allowable, or if, like, they're trying to focus purely on, like, stat space or, like, Rage Fist kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I actually think there's quite a bit of design space here. As Eye Crusher King mentions, even in description, there's like 3 examples: taking damage, stealing benefits, exploiting certain playstyles. And I think he mentions a lot of interesting ways to do this in his explanation, all of which seem to be very doable.
Yeah, I think it's a very good concept. I think it, sort of does something that we've not directly done before.
Yeah.
And I think it sort of engages with a lot of options that we've sort of looked at but never have done. Spectral Thief isn't in the game right now, but, like,
the idea of it.
Power swap, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, these are all, court change, etc. Really cool options that, we've never really touched, but I know we've definitely looked at.
Yeah.
That, they're just really, really good options that
I believe the
create
concept is fairly broad.
Yeah.
So with good concept assessment, I think this would turn out with something like a banger in cap terms.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. I need to convince myself a little bit more about it yet, but I think it's just a matter of like I don't quite see it yet. I think there's some concepts where you read it, you think, okay, yes, I can see how we would do that. I don't know how we assess if it's ultimately very successful, because beyond, like, you have to see it in matches, and the metagame will adapt to it. It's a matter of, like, will the metagame change, and will this thing still be able to survive? You know what I mean? And I know that we build primarily for the metagame that we are in, and we're not as concerned about, like, how the longevity or the shelf life of a cap is, but I especially just worry about, like, given that we will get DLC 1 midway through the process, how do we make sure that we don't just have miasma again, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I guess my one thing with this is I don't actually know how many, like, different actual options there are. Like, you know, we have Court Change, we have Rage Fist, we have Hour Swap, as much as that's a very mediocre move. And I'm sort of having trouble thinking of, like, a ton of extra options that explicitly, like, benefit from choices that the opponent chose to make.
Yeah. I think one of my hangups honestly might be in the name. Like, Parasite to me feels... I get why they use the term Parasite here, but, like, the examples that they're providing are less like stealing your opponent's boosts and more like your opponent is allowing you to mess with them, if that makes sense, you know? Like, it's not that you are getting more powerful as your in place of your opponent, or at least that's what it feels like. It's like more the actions of your opponent are making you powerful. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that one word, Parasite, is ultimately what's messing with me.
Didn't we have a concept in previous caps called Trap Card? I don't know if it got resubmitted this time.
It's not submitted yet, but it was last concept.
And I feel like that's pretty much this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you just, like, briefly elaborate on that?
Sure, like, you know, I forget the exact way it was stated, but, you know, just the basic concept of your opponent does something, you have this in the back, and then you ultimately benefit from what they did because of the condition they set up.
Card.
You know, they set rocks, you bring this in and use Court Change. They set up, you bring this in and use Opportunist, you know.
Exactly.
One thing I do think with this concept would be very interesting is, like, combining multiple of these, like, ways to steal the opponent's stuff, but that may not reach the same power level. You know, like, if we had a Court Change plus Opportunist, like, Opportunist by itself is very weak. But when you combine it with a stronger effect like Court Change, that is still relatively good, you know. Cinderace uses it all the time.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's not incredibly strong. You know, you would have a mod that has, like, two sort of niche effects that might combine to be, you know, greater than some of their parts.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you mentioned that you are worried about how this would work down the line when the meta has adapted to such.
I think that's a minor concern in the grand scheme of things.
Okay. Yeah, I just think that if we can, like, create this mod such that the meta is actually changing around it and people are starting to think about how to get around it, that's a success.
That's true.
For this concept.
That is true.
So in that way, I think it's very interesting as well.
Yeah, I think so too. I think you've definitely convinced me on this one, because I was a little wary on it, but I think it ultimately has to do with the fact of, like, when I think of Parasite, I think of I am getting stronger in place of them for what they do to themselves, rather than what they do to me.
Yeah, I think absolutely, like, this would very heavily benefit from just, like, changing its name to, like, again, Trap Card.
Yeah.
You know, get very explicit, like, the entire point is, like, your opponent does something, and you're the one who you get some benefit from what they did. It doesn't mean you're the one who benefits the most, but just like you get some benefit from that.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't we move on to version 3.3 by Brown for Sides, a Pokemon that attempts to recreate the playstyle and niche of a lower tier Pokemon. This can be from any tier that is lower than OU from any gen in the history of standard singles.
That's a lot of gens and a lot of mons.
Sure is.
That's
I know
a lot
that.
of scope.
Yeah, I know that when I talked with Brown Four Sides about this briefly, like in the Cord, I did mention the fact that like it's good that they have that broad design space to choose from. I just worry like, you know, at some point there needs to be a short list of these are the one things that we could do, like a playstyle of a lower tier niche Pokemon. And I think one thing that I think would be really interesting to explore with this concept is like, are there any really, really, really distinct Pokemon in lower tiers that like do something that we just don't see in higher tiers, for example, you know? I feel like one that was really prevalent in Qs you can talk about was like Comfy in, I think it's Gen 7 NU, which was CM Draining Kiss.
Yeah, I guess my main worry here is that, for example, if we choose Comfy, does that mean we have to be a triage draining kisser? Because, like, to me, the thing that defines it sort of is, like, you know, the priority plus the healing. You know, we've done Revenant, that sort of does that, but I guess my worry really is a lot of the mobs that are truly unique in lower tiers are truly unique because they have an option that is signature to them.
Yeah.
You know? So I guess that's my worry is like, would our concept assessment basically be setting our ability or our typing? And, you know, does that still lead to a satisfying process if we choose Comfy? Or does that mean we have to be triage? Or are there different ways to accomplish that, you know?
Yeah, how closely do we adhere to the lower tier Pokemon?
Yeah, and I think Brown for Sides does address this as his last question, which isn't, of course, entirely valid.
Yeah.
I do think this is a super broad concept, and having to choose a mon to model this on is going to be very lengthy.
Yes.
Or rather, very, very difficult to do. Because there's just so much.
Yeah, I feel like it's almost like you have to add a step between this concept assessment and then the first stage of topic leadership where it's like people are pitching which mon are we doing the concept on, you know what I mean? And I feel like that adds a full 2 weeks to the process.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd also worry about is, you know, we have lower tier people in the community. I'm one of them. I'm originally from NU as a tier. But I would worry a lot that a lot of the stuff people would be looking at would be based off of like decade-old lower tier analyses that are very out of date, you know?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because, let's be frank, a lot of people don't play the super lower tiers, and I don't think UU would be as applicable in a lot of cases, just because a lot of UU stuff does get used in OU. So, you know, we'd ultimately be looking at stuff that very few people have, like, the expertise to really drill down into a lot of these old gen lower tier mons, or even current gen lower tier mons, as much as I think current gen could be sort of just made very difficult by the fact that a lot of the lower tiers in the current gen are just so new that a lot of stuff hasn't really crystallized to the same extent.
Yeah, I think they should resubmit this this concept like a year from now, when the metagame is a little bit more stable and we understand how lower tiers are working. And I feel like it should be something from a lower tier in this gen. I think that would like condense it enough to still feel like it's a meaningful process while still offering a lot of like openness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think the issue of like, we'd have a lot of incentive to like look at stuff which has a signature, and that's my real worry here. Is like, if we choose Appleton, do we have to have?
That's exactly what I was thinking too with like Apple Acid.
You know, because that would be my main worry. Because like, there's a lot of lower tier stuff that has a very different playstyle from the stuff in OU, purely because it has a very high impact signature element. And I think if we chose that stuff, we'd have to have a very careful dance to just like not completely make one of the stages of the process completely irrelevant.
Agreed.
Yeah. I would agree as well. So I think this also ties back into like, how close are we going to replicate this mod?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just such a difficult question to answer at this point, that I'm not sure if this concept will be successful or not.
Yeah, I agree.
I think for a lot of stuff, you don't really have an option but to just completely replicate if you want to be anywhere close, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think especially playstyle is where I get really interested and invested with like how close we replicate it, because the idea of a playstyle versus a like signature concept, they're not always one-to-one. They're not always exactly the same. And I can't speak necessarily with direct examples here, but like, you know, just because something allows you to do a certain signature move or ability in one facet doesn't mean that it's exactly the same in a different way. You know, like if we're recreating the playstyle versus using a specific characteristic or niche that a Pokemon in a lower tier has, that is interesting because there's not really a direct translation, if that makes sense. Like, the circumstances are fundamentally different in this metagame compared to that lower tier. So are we trying to recreate the fact that it's like a bulky pivot with this signature thing that allows it to be that way? Or are we trying to like make it as close to that thing but good, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's just, I think there's a lot of, I think this would just be like way easier to do later on in the gen.
I agree.
Even if you are allowing it from A-gen, just because like, once we're later in the gen, we will have a much better idea of like what the lower tiers in the current gen look like. And the lower tiers in the current gen are a lot easier for us to replicate.
Mm-hmm.
Again, like how would you translate, for example, Gen 3 Waylord, you know, which is a special breaker that has a very, very strong explosion. You know, how do you replicate that? It's difficult.
Yeah, exactly. Sizz, you have any other thoughts?
I think you've said what I wanted to say. So,
okay.
Let's move on, I guess.
Okay, next one. Skipper Games Ability Neutralizer. This cap has multiple abilities that are equally viable, neither of them outshining the other. There's not a lot here to work with right now. So we'll give it a little bit of time. I don't know if this is like gonna be super great as an outcome, just because I think about like bulletproof versus levitate equilibra is kind of like where my mind goes to immediately, and that just, I don't know, it's tricky for me. I'm not a huge fan of this one. I think there's potential, but I need a lot more elaboration on it before I can really give it a good talk, you know?
I mean, it does seem like a easier to execute version of Schrodinger's cap.
Yes.
Because it drops the movability interaction element from it.
And I think that's, I think if, when we talk about Schrodinger's cap, that was its fundamental flaw. So I think, like, as you mentioned, this seems like just, okay, it's a little smaller of a concept, but it's going to be more efficient, I guess you could say.
Have less brain eroding, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
So, as last cap's ability leader, I have an opinion on this. Because a lot of the controversy, I think, for last cap was based around we had low stats, and therefore we needed to compensate with a good ability, basically. And then when secondary ability rolled around, there were basically two camps of people who said we need another really good ability, or we don't need secondary ability at all. And then there was the camp of people who were like, we just need a functional ability, basically, for secondary. And ultimately, we did end up with Intimidate, which is kind of passable, I guess, on Hemogoblin. However, a big part of the discussion around these two camps, I don't really want to call them camps, I guess, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's like, how good do we want these abilities to be?
A big part of the discussion. Big part of the discussion was also based on how the previous caps, Raja, got a really mediocre move pool because of the secondary ability that we gave it, which was supposed to be equally strong, I guess, except it wasn't.
What are those two abilities again?
And
it's
then,
Water Absorb and Sheer Force? No.
Serene Grace.
Serene Grace, that's it, yeah.
So with this cap, I think it'd be very difficult to balance two good, or well, I guess it should be equally competitively viable abilities around different moves, or even like stats. I think it's a little complicated.
I think it's almost easier if we just take a page from Dragapult's book and just go for niche abilities that don't really impact a ton during a typical match.
Yeah.
But, which is fair. We rarely, if ever, have caps with, niche abilities.
Yeah, the abilities almost are always, like, really good. I think that's one question that, if they do elaborate further, I would love to have them ask the question, how viable do these abilities need to be? Or how greatly does the ability contribute to the Pokemon's viability? Because they talk about Dragapult's 3 mediocre abilities, but I don't know if Dragapult's abilities are necessarily mediocre. Because Clear Body is really good in one capacity, and Infiltrator is really good in another. So I just I don't know. I'd like to have them talk about what they think how good the abilities should be when neither outshines the other. Are they both supposed to be extremely good, or are they both extremely bad?
Yeah, I think they do bring it up, but I think either would be possible. I just get, people love to optimize stuff super heavily.
Yeah.
And I would have the same wonder of just if this ends up running ability 1 95% of the time, is it still a success? Because let's be honest, almost everyone on the ability team just goes to the dex and just copies down the spread and just uses that mindlessly because
it's easier.
It's way easier. So this does just come up with the question of just if we end up having a quote unquote best ability, is that a failure?
Right, I agree. Ciz,
even with, sorry.
Oh, I was gonna ask if they had any others.
No, I would agree, actually.
Okay. Hughes, what was that last thought you had?
Basically, if we end up, with Bolt, it has the abilities that are all sort of viable on different sets, but let's be honest, Infiltrator is, outside of the screen sets, the most common by far.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a valid outcome?
Right. I mean, if they're both equally viable, viability often depends on, the team itself, because, there are certain Pokemon that are viable under specific circumstances, I wouldn't run a Floatzel on a team that didn't have rain, for example, I wouldn't put, a Crawdont, well, okay, maybe I would, but, a Trick Room team, I wouldn't use Fidget if I didn't have it specifically for putting up either Trick Room, or if I was trying to get really funky, like Tailwind or Gravity. You know what I mean? Like, it's viable in the sense that it enables a playstyle, but if I'm not going to use that playstyle, that's not necessarily viable. Okay, why don't we move on then to the Weatherman, which is a pretty straightforward one. This cap utilizes abilities and typings to influence and or take advantage of field or weather effects. Yeah, I don't know. This one's fine, I guess. It doesn't really inspire me much because it's going to get locked down very quickly. It's like, are we just doing one field effect? Are we doing as many as we can? If we are, like, if we try to do everything, do we end up just getting like a jack of all trades, master of none? Like, this concept, I think, needs a lot more development in order to be really, really good. You know, and even then, I'm sort of about it.
I'll be honest, this is just Jumbeo. Like, Jumbeo very explicitly was, let's be good in 2 weathers. This is, let's be good in at least 1 weather. You know, I think that's my main complaint with it. It's just like, Jumbeo sort of did it, and Pip's concept sort of encompasses the rest of the design space.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Iron Templar might benefit from adding some more in-depth questions.
Yeah, 100%.
A little bit more explanation on what he wants exactly.
Yeah, because just asking the questions, what weather, what advantages would we get? And like, well, I can tell you if we pick rain and use Swift Sim, we're faster. Like, boom, question answered. As opposed to like, how would the choice of, you know, using a field terrain versus a weather effect have its own pros and cons? You know, like, there needs to be more depth here. All right. Let's move on to Strategy's Bane by Samirson. This Pokemon specializes in shutting down strategies, providing disruption and counterplay in a variety of battle scenarios, or maybe just a specific one. This Pokemon's unique abilities and movesets are strategically designed to hinder key components of multiple strategies, promoting adaptability and strategic depth in the metagame. This feels like a very metagame specific, like, we're pointing at a problem in the metagame, and we're gonna solve it with this Pokemon, you know? That's what this concept feels like to me.
Yeah, it's, this feels very sort of, not very difficult to understand, but like, sort of difficult to get my teeth into because, you know, we're shutting down various strategies, but I feel like Create a Parasite almost covers some of the elements I like about this concept, but in a more explicit way.
Yes, I agree.
Me too, yeah.
I think,
you know, this is sort of hurt by just being submitted after Create a Parasite, honestly.
Yeah, and I think, too, like, it's almost too general. You know, I would love to... But at the same time, if you get any more specific, then you start to worry about, like, it's picking out a precise feature of the current metagame that we face, and then it's like, well, you know, that's... I am not a big fan... I'm a big fan of making, like, evergreen processes, if that makes sense, you know? I don't like processes that are dependent on exact things related to the metagame, if that makes sense. But that's my personal preference, just to be very frank.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely ways to make it more general, but I guess I just do prefer Create a Parasite, and I think that has a more explicit focus on, like, again, ways to explicitly punish specific options for it. And I think the punishment aspect is almost more interesting than, like, resetting progress, you know, like Haze Hawk, you know, definitely fits within this concept, but it doesn't fit within Create a Parasite Create a Parasite. And I think because of that fact, I think Create a Parasite is more interesting to me. And again, I think, you know, if this was submitted earlier, I think I probably would have received it better, but, you know, psychology is psychology.
That's how it goes.
You've pretty much said what I wanted to say for this one.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have too many other things I want to talk about at this point. I do think that their questions are pretty well defined and pretty interesting to think about. So that is definitely a strength of this pitch. I think just with what Hughes has said with, like, it's just a little late to the table, which, it's still on page 1, so a little concerning.
Yeah, I mean...
Yeah, but I think...
That's just sort of how CAP ends up going, is that, like, unless you take an idea that was submitted earlier in the thread and substantially expand on it, or substantially, like, or offer a different interpretation of the same idea, but done in a very, very, like exceptionally, like, 10 out of 10 way, the, first submission thing does sort of just end up catching up with you.
Yeah, I agree. Let's move on to the Spore This cap is built around using the move Spore to the best of its ability. This was just Snake's concept nap time last time, and I don't like it. I think sleep is a fundamentally uncompetitive Pokemon concept, and I just don't like the idea of this Pokemon gets Spore.
No, I don't like sleep either.
Actually, be a dissenting voice in that, like, I think Cap's lifeblood is sort of pushing the boundaries, and we have never touched sleep before.
That is true.
I do think the interactions with sleep as like a facet in the current meta game where we have sleep clause is potentially interesting. However, the metagame player in me absolutely hates Spore, and therefore I do not like this concept.
I am kind of in the same boat as he says. I think it would make for an interesting process, but I don't want to make a Pokemon that has Spore and uses it amazingly, just because I have played Gen 5, and I have played metagames where, like, sleep was just banned. Like, it's just not fun, in my opinion, to play against Pokemon that have sleep, and I'd rather not make a Pokemon like that. And that's just a personal bias, like, that's just my opinion, but I would put this very low if it was on the slated list of concepts, just out of pure, I don't want to do this.
I mean, I think that's something that's true of Cap in every case. We do not like making bonds that would be unfun to face.
That's true.
I personally would argue that we should be more open to do that, but I also do understand that, this is going to be something we're going to be stuck with for ages after making it. So nobody wants to make, like, PP storing pressure boy.
Nobody wants to make a defensive Pokemon.
Yeah. I mean...
And speaking of those...
Yeah.
If we're good to move on from this one.
Yeah, so this next one is my concept.
This is Qz's. Very fast and movable object. This is a wall that has high speed.
Yeah, I probably should expand that and reword it to be, like, slightly more interesting, and as you can tell, it's sort of in a half-written state because I've not seen that 48-hour warning yet.
Yeah.
But Cap has never really explicitly made a defensive mod. We've made tanks, definitely, Argonauts. But, like, even Argonauts are the one that ends up being a wall.
Yeah, Cyclone.
A major part of its process was potentially being, Technician Man.
Mm-hmm.
Venomigon, which gets used as a wall nowadays, was originally created to be an acid plot sweeper.
Yeah.
So we've never made a purely defensive mod. And frankly, this is a bit of politicking, but I also just sort of felt that, if we did, folks generally don't like voting for purely defensive concepts. And I felt that making it fast and be sort of unique that way was probably a way to get a bit higher on people's votes.
Yeah. I mean,
which is purely political.
But Screamtail and Mega Latias and Defensive Talonflame, like, the ones you bring up, those are really interesting Pokemon to me. Gliscor, I love that you bring up Gliscor here, because I think of Gliscor, and I immediately think about how its speed is one of the reasons why it is so effective at being a defensive Pokemon. And I like this concept because there is so much that we can explore into the idea of how speed and defense can play well together, while still creating a Pokemon that, like, isn't just, it's slow and it takes hits, Like, I want to see what this can be done with. I'm a fan.
I think it's also worth noting that every single ball, their offensive capabilities, even if they're low, like even Toxapex, which hits like a wet paper towel, the ability to have some sort of threat offensively is very important, even at very low power levels. And, Gliscor, a lot of why I invested in speed is purely just so it can outrun and then just one-hit Heatran, because that lets it check Heatran.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think the idea of having the speed purely so we can outspeed certain threats with minimal investment is really, really interesting. In the way that, like you said, the offensive pressure that we sort of artificially create here might go the distance on separating us from other like walls.
Yeah, definitely.
I think Scream Tail is also an excellent example because that one does not hit.
It does not. It has like what, base 63 attack or something?
I think it's like
does not do numbers.
60 something, and it's working purely off of the base 80, Dazzling Gleam, which does not hit.
Yeah.
But the speed stat means that its encore is
more annoying than Astrolotl.
You can't set up on Scream Tail. You can't if you click anything except for a super effective hit, it's just gonna encore you, wish up, and then heal back a teammate to 100%.
100%, yeah. I look forward to seeing the final form of this pitch because I think it's got a lot of room to work, and I would definitely vote for it if it was slated. Are we good to move on?
Yeah.
Okay. Next up is Mage Killer, a tank that utilizes incredible special bulk to generate offensive momentum. I think that this concept is flawed because of its name. I think, I get, as someone who has named concepts after, D&D or RPGs, and having it sort of, the terms not necessarily translate one-to-one, I think Mage Killer would really benefit from not choosing special bulk, but rather using its specific bulk to kill the momentum of either physical or special. I think that pumping one defensive stat, it should make that not decide whether it's physical or special, because by doing so right now, it is primarily focusing on, this is going to have a high special defense stat, so much so that it basically shuts down any special attacker in the game.
I think it's just as valid to say, this has a high physical defense, so,
yeah.
Even just this mon has really big bulk in some manner,
Yeah.
Think of Dragonite, where so much of that mon's strength is just multi-scale, you know?
I agree.
I think that's a valid way to look at this concept. And I think that
thinking of mons like Bartana here, which really have non-existent special defense, but the physical defense is passable enough that you don't want to let this thing in.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. Its physical defense means it can come in on stuff that want to hit that, and then, or that want to attack with physical attacks. It comes in and then immediately pressures the entire team because it's got a switch in.
I think just sort of boiling it down to this mon has substantial bulk on that is limited in some manner and uses that to generate offensive switch-ins or offensive pressure. I think that boiling it down to that, and just it has limited but good bulk and it uses that offensively. I think boiling it down to that is substantially better to me than just this has really good special bulk. And I think they also bring up that they want very good special bulk and really good attack.
Yeah.
Which is sort of just making them on.
Yeah. I think if they make this more general with what it is it's going to be having for stats, this could be a successful concept. As it is right now, it needs to be more general.
Yes.
Okay. Y'all good to move on?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next up is Create a Pivot. This Pokemon is neither Potent Sweeper nor the Perfect Wall. It's neither offense by nature or defense by nature. All it does is come in, make room for different Pokemon to enter the field. I think this concept is kind of flawed because in order to be a pivot, you have to be offensive or defensive. Like, it wants to either have its cake and eat it too, or it's just like a Pokemon that comes in and then leaves. I feel like you can't be a pivot without being either offensive or defensive.
No, you really need to pressure the opponent.
This is on call
because-
Lottle.
Sorry?
This is on call Lottle.
Yeah.
Like, that's literally...
I guess, but mostly as like pivots, you really want to either force the opponent out because you're going to kill them, or force the opponent out because they can't kill you. And if you don't have either of these things, then what is the point?
You could uncle them.
I think Cap also
Yeah,
has
I
like
guess.
it has a slight problem with like the idea of a quote pivot because like, you know, the past few concepts would be like, we're gonna make this a pivot. Okay, like what kind of pivot? What is going to define a pivot for us in this case? Because I think that this concept really sort of highlights the trouble that might come around if we try to make just a pivot, because pivot is an overarching term and we need to be more specific, you know? And I feel like this concept actively says we are not going to make it specific.
Yeah, I think this really just does sort of come down to the fact that, like, I think we've explored what it means to be a pivot
Yeah.
implicitly or explicitly a lot. You know, like
Yes.
Kilowatt, Libra, Astromodel, these are all very effective pivots in different ways. Even Cyclant, sorry, Cyclant, I think is the official pronunciation. But, you know, I think it sort of treads ground that we've already tread in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And, you know, it sort of also asks us to make a very jack of all trades kind of product
I
in a
agree.
way that I don't think really benefits the project or is very interesting to me. So, yeah.
Ciz, you have any other thoughts?
I don't think so.
All right, then let's move on here to Feng Huang's Mixed Attacker. Create a mixed attack offensive powerhouse, which is much better than it is unmixed. I think that last little bit, better mixed than unmixed, is really interesting, and like it's not the worst concept. I think it could have some legs to it. I would just be curious to see what is the measure of success here.
I mean, I think the meta as it is actually really well set up for a mixed attacker to shine, just purely off of Venomicon being a trop, you know? So I think the meta absolutely is set up such that we really could make a good mixed attacker. It's just, there's not that much else to this.
Yes.
I think, you know,
Yes.
if we had, I think being a mixed attacker is something that a lot of other concepts would love to be, but I just don't know if, like, you know, make a mixed attacker is going to be a super, and I think it just comes down to novelty, you know? I don't think it's a very novel process to end up in.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I like the idea. I want there to be more. I don't know what more would look like, but I feel like, again, maybe gauging what successful mixed attackers look like. Like, is this a Pokemon that runs 3 physical attacks and then a special attack that's like stab, but then that's explicitly designed to take out a certain threat or two? Or is it like a 50-50 thing where you're running like close combat, Moonblast? You know, like I wanna see how mixed we're getting, and maybe also like, you know, to what extent we discourage leaning into one or the other.
Yeah, I think
I think Cap has had a lot of Pokemon with mixed attacking stats that just don't want to.
Yeah, like Hemogoblin last time.
Like Hemogoblin, also like Miasmal, for
Ashwaggle.
example. Yeah. And other than like niche tech options, these Pokemon really don't see any mixed play, pretty much. So I think it's pretty difficult to actually make a workable product here.
Yeah.
I do think it's a lot more possible if we go into it like explicitly trying to make a mixed attacker. I just don't know if like the easy routes to do that, which are basically make it so that the other side offers something that you cannot do on the one side. You know, like we made a mon with 170 base attack that has one physical move.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, or like, we made a mon that can only hit Venomicon super effectively with its stab on the special side, you know, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I think it's something that I just like to get more development on it, because I think that there is potential, but it just needs a little bit more to really make it feel like it'd be a really good process. Next up, Gecko Queso's The Terraformer. This Pokemon is able to successfully set and or utilize terrain to either improve its own performance, support its team, or do both at the same time. So this is essentially like, you know, Tapu Koko last gen, or like Rillaboom and Cart kind of situation here. It feels a lot like that one, the Weatherman, like Iron Templar's concept, in that it's just like, okay, terrain abuser.
Yeah, I guess my thing is like, there's one terrain that's fringe viable right now, being psychic terrain. Electric terrain isn't really, I mean, grassy terrain is viable, let's be honest with that.
Electric terrain isn't because there's no setters.
Yeah. So grassy terrain, there's a setter. It does get some use, but it's not flashy at all. You know, most of the reason you use grassy terrain is like sort of the niche, like
give your Heatran a fighting chance.
And then, yeah, or like I think we saw one time in World Cup where there was like a King Gambit that used Terra Blast to bypass Stole with grassy terrain support.
Yeah.
But I just don't know that there's enough in grassy terrain to bring it beyond sort of niche interactions. Psychic terrain's great, you know, we can use that.
Yes.
And the other route is just we make an electric terrain or psychic terrain setter. I don't think the other two terrain types are really viable as setters.
And I can't see a good Misty terrain abuse.
Making
I think Size Spam
also like
right now
no setters.
Size Spam is kind of real at the moment. Just kind of fringe.
Yeah.
But it does exist. Then grassy terrain, like you said, they're not that interesting. But it works. Misty terrain is really hard to actually make use of. Other than like we're immune to status for a few turns.
It's also explicitly that we're doing it for our team if we're a setter. So I don't think Mystery Train really works because, like, number one, there's not actually that much status going around right now.
Well, it says do both, so I mean, it could be a self-sufficient.
Yeah. Then, like, electric terrain is difficult because of Spark Drive being around.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to open that.
No, that's kind of
That's
a little bit spooky.
Yeah. Like, if you make an electric terrain setter that's better than friggin' Pinch Kirchen, it will be viable. It will 100% be as viable in the way that Pelipper suddenly became viable the moment it got Drizzle.
If we make, like, the cap standard, like, mid-500s BST, good typing, electric surge, we are making the cap metagame incredibly different from OU.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't really want to open up that Pandora's box.
That was the exact term I was thinking of in my head, too. Like, this is a Pandora's box waiting to be opened.
It is an entirely different kind of form.
Yeah.
That's really just it for me. Like, I don't want to open Pandora's box, and I don't want to just make a mon that makes Psychic Terrain, like, terrain spam slightly better. Because, like, we're either slightly power creeping in DD, or we're making the expanding force user.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah. No further thoughts. All right. Why don't we move on? Next up, we have Wounded Warrior by Sawyer. This Pokemon becomes more useful when it is at low HP. I think this one's really cool. I think it's really neat. Just because, like, there's a lot of different ways to explore what it means to get stronger as you have lower and lower HP. You can obviously do, like, bullshit like, Flail, which is never a good move, but, like, that's sort of where my brain initially goes to. But then you have, like, Pinch Berries, or you have Pain Split. I think those are really cool, and, like, does it mean to take damage and get a positive result from that, you know? I think that's a really cool idea to explore, and this concept does present that with, like, Anger Shell, you know?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of very interesting, subtle ways to be very successful with this concept.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key thing for me. Like, I think the pinch abilities are probably the most interesting way for me to think about this concept.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the flashier ways, by contrast, you know, Pinch Berries, like Flail, I think those are very, very risky.
I agree.
And I just don't know if we would be... My criticism, I guess, is that, like, I don't know if we'd be satisfied with a mon that has a lot of the concept central stuff being very subtle, or if we're going to try to want it to be, like, very flashy. Because I think it's, like, very flashy stuff that's very hard to achieve, very, very volatile. You know, like, let's be honest, the Salad Berry Abuser would be incredibly hard to have a successful concept on. It's because, like,
Yeah, was it
there's so many ways to work around
Leon?
that.
Or Sub-Salic and Leon in Gen 4.
Versus just, like, you know, we made a mon that, like, is strongest when you position it to be at, like, 30% HP under rain with a torque boost, you know?
That's scary. Like, that would be really cool.
I think that's really cool, but, like, I just wonder if, like, is that too subtle?
Yeah, I think you have a very good point with that. I think the best way to accomplish that is, like, a subtle answer, as you mentioned.
Yeah. I think we've seen this concept before, and it's done actually pretty well, I think, in the polls before. Personally, I kind of like it. There's many different ways to do this, and yeah.
I mean, actually, even just sub-endeavor is, like, very valid here. Like, we've seen that be successful in OU before.
Mm-hmm.
Even in relatively recent gens with that, the one Mega Dynasty set. So, I think this is a very valid concept. I just worry that, like, we like flashy stuff because it's fun to use, it's interesting, it's flashy. And I just think the flashy boots are very, very difficult to achieve compared to, like, the more subtle, like, not necessarily it is well explored. You know, we've seen multiple generations of, like, starters, especially in lower tiers, that, like, when they get into pinch range, they just demolish stuff.
Yes, like
And
Solar, or not, so that's Solar.
Zard.
Yeah, but, like,
Zard.
Blaze Zard.
I mean, lower tiers, you know, SD Samurai, you know, it gets into pouring range and it just kills stuff.
Yes. Definitely
So
an
I guess,
interesting
like,
idea.
Or actually, one of our own creations, you know, Blaze Smokamoto.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, because, like, no one uses Technician Smokamoto, despite Smokamoto being made to use with Technician.
They do this gen, but, you know, that's very specific to this gen.
Yeah. Yep, I think it's a good concept. I would vote for it.
Yeah.
I think so too. Yeah.
Alright, we have Sneaky Jeans' Training Dummy. This Pokemon is designed to teach new players the basics of competitive gameplay. I mean, like, it's very different. It's a very different concept from anything else being submitted, because its success is entirely contingent on people who have never played Pokemon before, I guess.
Somewhat ironically, I think this would be a very difficult concept.
Yeah, oh yeah, totally. Because all of us who are
yeah.
there, I think you'd have to ask the players who don't play. You'd have to find people who don't play and ask them, okay, what doesn't make sense to you? And I think that we as a community all have that knowledge, so maybe this is a good concept in the sense that, like, it encourages us to, like, consider an outside perspective as we make it. But
I think this concept is kind of like too meta, ironically.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, again, what does it mean to make a mon that is good at teaching stuff? Because, like, I think it's very easy to make a mon that is good, that is easy to use, but does that teach stuff?
Yeah.
It's...
Like,
again,
would this look
ironically,
like something teaching you the value of EVs, where, like, if you don't give 4 EVs and it's speed, now it doesn't outspeed, it's something it's supposed to check or something? Or, like, you know what I mean? Like, showing,
like,
teaching the merit of proper EV
basic
training?
Or, like, is it just like, you know, a Dragon Ball where it teaches, it's very good at teaching the values of just, like, trying to set up for an end game, you know? I think...
What are we trying to teach?
Yeah. Like,
Yeah.
even just, like, are we trying to teach people how important getting rocks up is?
Yeah.
Are we making a mon that uses assurance?
Or are we making Battling 101 the Pokemon? I think, like, it's a little too meta for my tastes.
I think it's great at, like, I think it would be a very, very useful concept if we do it right.
Yeah, but I don't think we
But-
can do it right.
It's very
This is
dependent
less-
on good concept assessments.
Yeah, this is less about the mon itself and more so about the meta and community, which I'm not sure if we want to open that can of worms.
Yeah, I would love it. I would love to see this again when the metagame is stable.
That too, yeah.
Okay, let's move to Tomaniacal's Game of Inches. This has been submitted plenty of times in previous things. Qz, I think you even submitted this at one point, where it's a Pokemon that uses incremental damage and recovery effects in Cap to be
I
successful.
think I was considering it. I don't know if I did explicitly submit it, but yeah. This is a classic concept.
Yep.
It's been submitted a trillion times. It's always a very interesting one. I think it's placed a number of times fairly high.
It's been
in
slated
concept polls.
plenty of times, yeah.
And I think, like, the focus on, like, should we be good at doing incremental damage or, like, resisting incremental damage is an interesting one, especially in the context of, like, you know, Covert Cloak being
Yeah,
introduced this gen.
yeah, that is
So-
interesting.
I think it's a very interesting concept. I think, yeah, it's a good concept. I don't have a ton to say. It's been submitted a trillion times, so,
Yeah.
and it obviously, you know, it's been submitted a trillion times for a good reason.
Yep, I
I
agree.
think
Good
I think
concept.
the community consensus on this concept is pretty well known, and I don't think it has a fighting chance because it's been sort of popular.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
Nothing
it's
new
never,
on it.
it's never won, you know?
always the bridesmaid, never the bride.
Yeah,
I think this one is like, it's good, but it's not exciting. You know? I think that's mainly what it comes down to.
I think also just the context of, you know, Garg.
Yeah. It's like
Being,
now
like,
now we could consider like
Garg uses
how we
Covert
sort-
Cloak.
Yeah.
Garg uses Covert Cloak and also uses Salt Cure as its main damage.
Yeah. It's like, they explored it with Garganackle. How about that?
I think, you know, Garg also makes a very good case on, like, why we should be very good at resisting passive damage. But, like,
Mhm.
you know, just having that in the meta, like, yeah.
Yep. I agree. I'm good to move on.
yeah.
Alright, next we have Ken's Position is Key. This cap excels during one particular stage of the game at the cost of being weaker than average during other stages of the game. So, like, you
I
know...
love this.
Sorry?
I love this.
I think it's great too.
It's a good concept, yeah.
Yeah. And the reason I think it's really good is it forces us to consider what good play looks like at each stage of the game. Because, like, you take, like, Hisui and Samurott, which is amazing in those early turns, but it's not as good in the late game, whereas, like, things like King Gambit, or Sneasler, like, those are much better in late game compared to anything in the early game. I would never bring in I would very rarely would I ever bring in a King Gambit on, like, turn 3, you know? Whereas I would love to bring it in on turn 105.
I think it's also, like, it does sort of open up the idea of, like, I think we usually conceptualize a lot of roles, offensive roles, as early game or late game, but,
Yes.
like, does that also apply to defensive roles? Like, you know, think of, like, Rotom Wash. Is Rotom Wash it's probably a mid-game mod.
I would agree. Road
I'm
and Wash is a
thinking
mid-game mod.
I'm thinking about this in the same way as we did for Amama's concept, the pawn.
Yeah.
Where, like we mentioned, Toxapex is being really good at checking certain things in the early mid-game, but then it's no longer useful.
It's almost dead weight in
late game.
games if it's not checking stuff.
I don't agree with that. Pex, those late game like Pex sequences where you're just using Pex to endlessly store PP. That's almost where it shines.
Yeah, but if you're not in a space where Pex can do that, then you can't have Pex close out the game. I agree that Pex can close out games, and I agree because I know that you love doing that in your fights, and I know that was like a concept that you had previously brought up, was like something that is like, it's unable to be beaten in the late game if you position yourself right. I just think that this cap process in particular would really, really be good because it allows us to explicitly think about how can we play better.
Yeah, and I think there's a really big question here that I think is brought up in one of the questions. It's just like, what kind of teams can afford a mon that is significantly better in early or late game? Is it purely just the offensive teams? Like HO, we all know like the HO example of just like the Sash lead.
Yeah.
Like a mon that exists purely just get rocks up and then Fate.
Do you remember
that's its entire purpose in the game?
Do you remember Blunder's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 team?
Do not, but we had the cap team actually last gen where like the team was literally just like 3v3 where like you lead with the final gambit user, you then go to another final gambit user, and then you go to a third final gambit user, and you try to get the game down to 3v3,
Yeah.
But I guess the question is then, like, King Gambit brings up a great point of just like, this is a mon that fits on balance of bulky offense, where like, sure, it's okay in the early game. Like, a King Gambit in the early game can definitely sucker punch stuff,
Mm-hmm.
But
it's
King
better
Gambit is
late.
at its best when it's like in a 1v5 situation. So like, are there examples of other mons where like they are really, really good early or late game and still fit onto these not necessarily like as flowcharty styles?
Yeah.
I can give you an example of this.
Yeah.
It's like Zero Aura last gen basically existed in the early game to knock a Lando, and then you wouldn't see it until Lando was at like 20%, and that's when it like actually went hyper mode and killed the entire team.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it.
I think these sort of mons also fit within this concept.
I think
so I think it's a
great example.
It's a strong concept.
Yes, 100%. And it's
it
really
could
well
be
written.
I think it could be a bit difficult with like certain parts of it. Just like trying to evaluate various options, and like when would we decide whether we want to be early game or late game? Is it after typing? Is it after ability?
Yeah, I think that's the only other question we'd have to ask ourselves. But like, I think it would be an interesting one to explore. So that's my take. Any other thoughts on this one?
Nope.
All right.
I think we've covered it.
All right. Next one, Timeless. This Pokemon should be able to succeed regardless of meta-specific factors. I'm not a fan of this one because it's, one, impossible to predict what the future of Pokemon will look like. We can always try to, like, look at, oh yeah, how has something from Gen 5 stayed around for as long as it has? But, like, when we look at stuff like Tyranitar, for example, we never could have predicted that they just removed Pursuit from the game. And Pursuit is, like...
Excadrill.
Sorry?
And Excadrill.
Yeah. Like, there was just factors that we will never be able to know that, like, you can't prepare for. Equilibra loses Doom Desire, but it's still good because of its stats and move pool, sure. And its typing, and its abilities. So...
Or, like, also with Gen 9, sorry, like, hey, every single recovery move is 8 PP now.
Yeah.
And Toxapex also lost Scald.
It's just impossible to predict what will happen. And I get what they're trying to do here, the imposter's trying to do, but I just don't think this is going to be... I don't think you can get a concept out of this.
I think another thing is, like, it's a bit difficult to evaluate success on this project
Yes.
because, like, to a large extent, the success of this project is going to be determined like 2 or 3 years down the line.
Yeah. If anything, the only
True,
time I
actually.
think... Sorry, go for it.
No, I just wanted to say that it's true.
Yeah. I think the only time this concept would have any meaning whatsoever would be at the turn of a generation. And even then, it's like, as you mentioned, QZL, you would need to have a good year, 2 years, even like multiple generations worth of time in order to see if it is successful. Because, like, you look at stuff like Saharaja, for example, was viable when it came out, and it was really good. And now it's not really good now. And I mean, like, there's that, so I guess it wasn't really metagame specific. It held up.
I mean,
Here's
look
actually
at
a really good example.
Recto.
Sorry, that was a bad example. But Clefable. Clefable was not amazing until it got the fairy type, right?
Yeah, I mean, look at Starmie, for example.
Yeah.
Great until like Gen 6, and then suddenly Greninja appears.
It's just impossible to predict what the actual Pokemon company will do, and I cannot in good faith really vote for this one because we have no way to predict. My dad does not work for Nintendo.
Yeah, next.
This one's mine! Parry and Riposte. This Pokemon is able to parry and or riposte, which is counterattack, an opponent's actions with a well-timed action from the user. This parry and riposte may be done passively from the Pokemon's inherent features, like its ability, or more actively accomplished through use of specific moves, or both. I submitted this last round. It's one that got some good traction. It was compared to, like, Trap Card. Trap Card got slated over this, but I got a lot of positive feedback saying that people really liked this one, so I just resubmitted it. I think it's a cool idea for a concept where there's a lot of different ways that you can sort of counterattack your opponent through either active or passive means. And I basically liken this to, like, Marth's down B in Smash Melee, or K-Rool's Gut Check in Smash Ultimate, for example. I don't know, since I wrote this one, I have kind of a good insight on it, but what do you two think?
I think my main issue is that, like, a lot of the options that I think are, like, most directly relevant to this have sort of just been removed in the gen change.
Yeah.
Like, I think you mentioned mentioning obstruct somewhere in the explanation, but, like, that move's gone.
It is.
You know? Like, Beak Blast, another great example of, like, a move that sort of just directly punishes your opponent for choosing a specific option while you're on the field. That's gone. So I guess that's my main thing, is just, like, a lot of the options that I think are, like, the most interesting, the most relevant here are just sort of out of the game right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it sort of makes the design process a lot more difficult when a lot of these don't exist, because, like, the natural inclination I have is just like, yo, let's use one of these moves that is made directly to do the concept. And they simply are not there.
Yeah.
Granted, number are.
I do like this concept, I think. It combines what Creative Parasite is doing, basically, with Wounded Warrior,
Yeah.
a little bit. And then some more tidbits from other concepts that we've seen over the years. I think it's pretty broad, yet the actual options that we have here have kind of, like you said, disappeared almost.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm struggling to gauge how successful we will be with concept assessment and, like, actually assessing whether this is successful as a cap.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things that I think is really disappointing is, as you mentioned, the removal of, like, Beak Blast. Beak Blast is a really interesting one where immediately we punish the person for, like, attacking because we burn them if they make contact with us when we do this attack. I think that was a really cool idea, and it's too bad that it's not in the game. it's really too bad. But I did add a section for terastallization now that we're pretty confident that Terra will be in this going forward. And I think that there is some merit to exploring this concept of parrying by using your Terra type, for example, to parry, and sort of take advantage of what the opponent has done. Obviously, it shouldn't be like the only way to do it, but I think it could make for an interesting exploration. I do think that there is some other parts of it too, but I'm biased, so we don't have to discuss this two more. We have one more on this page, and then we've made it to the bottom of page 1.
Hooray!
All right. Unless anyone wants to talk about this at more length, we can move on.
Yeah, let's get on to...
All right.
I'll take the lead on this one.
Jagafel's One Trick Pony. This Pokemon has one stat that is significantly higher than the rest of its spread.
Yeah, I think this has been submitted before.
I think
so.
so.
Something similar.
I kind of submitted this a few processes ago.
I think it's good. I mean, I think there's a lot we can learn by just not, like...
There are a lot of interesting possibilities here, depending on which stat we go for. Especially with, like, the defenses or speed.
Yes.
Maybe HP too. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward as a concept, but it's simple, but it works. And I would like to see something along the lines of what Cloyster has been doing for ages, which is just having a big ass defense stat and just never using it.
Yeah.
But still, just using it to shell smash on everything.
Yeah.
That's something really cool about this concept, I think.
Yeah. I would love to see if they could tie a way into considering, like, typing into this as well. Because the examples that they provided, Regice having a really high special defense, but Ice is a terrible defensive typing, you know? Whereas, like, Orthworm, with its really high defense, its Steel type is really good with defense, and it also has the ability of, like, Earth Eater, so it's already immune to ground. So, like, if you're gonna hit Orthworm, you should probably just punch it with, like, a special attacking option. Or, like, Rampardos with a Rock type. You know, Rock is an inherently offensive typing. It's just that, like, every good Rock type attack that's physical just has some extreme net negative, whether it's, like, poor accuracy or you need to recharge after using it. You know? So I'd be curious to see how typing plays a part of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think Breloom is also a great example for attack. Just, like, it has attack and nothing.
Yeah.
You know? So I think there's a lot of good design space here. I do almost feel like it's 4-ish concepts in one, though, if that makes any sense.
Can you elaborate just a little bit?
I think, like, Speed Demon, you know, that was submitted last cap, you know, just like, this is a mon that is very fast and doesn't have too much else,
yes.
You know? I think, like, the one defense is significantly higher than the other, you know, that was the Mage Killer concept we submitted earlier.
Yes.
You know, I think, like, offense is great, it has nothing else, is also, like, sort of a concept, you know? So, I guess that's my main thing, it's just, like, I feel like this is a lot of different stuff that, you know, concept assessment is sort of going to be a separate concept choice, because the roots are just so different from each other in a lot of cases. In that, like, you know, again, like, if we chose speed, that is a absurdly different path that we would have out of it than to, like, HP.
Yeah, 100%.
So yeah, that's my only thing. I think it could absolutely result in a good cap.
Yeah. What do you think, Ciz?
Oh, I think you summed it up pretty well. It's pretty simple, yet there's layers to this that we were going to have to explore if this wins. And I personally would vote for this, I think. But I don't know if that's a common... If I'm within, like, the majority of people.
I think I'd vote for this one. At least I'd put it above some... I'd have to see what it was slated against, but I'd definitely put this, like, at least in the middle, you know? Like, I like it. It's not my favorite, but I don't hate it. You know? It's not like if this got slated, I would be like, no, I do not want to do this one.
Yeah, I think it's, honestly, its main issue really is just that it is not flashy at all.
Right.
And flashiness typically wins votes. And I don't think that there's like a way to really escape that while maintaining the concept, you know?
I agree.
So I think it's a good concept. I'd probably rank it more towards the mid of the slate.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm ever voting it like number one, but I think there's a lot of good stuff you could have in the process. I think there's some good stuff in like interest.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, page 2. Wolf's concept. No shuckles given. This is a Pokemon that would be built around minimal to no focus on its offensive capabilities. Again, I really like this one. I don't know if the Grand Cap vibe society would like it as much, just because, like, Cap loves their offense. But this is a really good concept. I think it's well written. I think it's got great questions.
I said it before, I think the time is very ripe to do a defensive concept. My main question here is how accepted. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion during concept assessment of like, would we accept a, Gen 7 packs, Greed packs, I brought it up a lot, but like Scald, Knock, Toxic,
Yep.
53 base special attack, but it's still absurdly difficult to switch into. I guess that would be my question, is like, is a mon that's like very difficult to switch into but has no offense is acceptable? I think that's going to be one of the big questions. Or do we want to go more down like it has seismic toss?
Yeah. Like on the sliding scale of Chansey versus Toxapex, where do we land on that? Chansey and Ferrothorn, where do we land?
Yeah. That's
I'm also thinking like,
example.
Are we making Pyukumuku or but like obviously Pyukumuku has no damaging moves besides I think Bite and Counter.
Yeah.
I guess to make it sort of more explicit, are we making a passive mon or are we making a defensive mon?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something that, does Wolf differentiate that in his questions?
I think he brings it up explicitly.
Yeah,
that's
even less offensive mons, immediately force damage or want to put minimal focus on offense.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a very big part of the concept assessment if this gets chosen.
Yep.
That said, I really like them on. It's,
great.
I think the time is very ripe to do a defensive concept. We've never done it before, and I would absolutely put this very close to the top of my vote if it got slated.
Yep, I would agree.
Me too. Yeah.
Okay. Violin Basis Catch 22. Do we want to talk about this one?
I'd not mind going over it sort of short.
Yeah.
Again, it forces the opponent to make sacrifices to get past it.
Yep.
My main criticism is that, like, I think it's going to be very difficult to set this up because a lot of why you make sacrifices to get past them on is intensely game specific. I am absolutely willing to make a sacrifice to get past Ferrothorn if I have another mon on my team that needs Ferrothorn dead. Otherwise, I'm just going to try to like switch around and like sort of pressure it out passively,
Yeah.
So I guess that's my main criticism. I think the main goal is very, very game state dependent and very, very game dependent in general.
Yeah, it's hard to...
I would wonder if it's possible to really do that.
It's hard to normalize.
I think it's hard to consistently have this work, I think.
I think there's ways, but like I think those ways are going to be sort of railroady, the tank chomp, where like to get past the tank chomp if you don't have a special attacker,
I think this is one of those concepts that from a process standpoint and in theory is very cool. However, in practice it's really hard to do.
Yep. I would agree. I think it's just a matter of like, how do you gauge success on this one? It's really hard for me to understand what we are looking for in a successful concept.
Yeah. Okay. I'm fine with
Optimized item user by Ultra Mafia. Cap 33 would be optimized around the use of one or more specific held items. Specific items would be the best pick for Cap 33 and should meaningfully contribute. I mean, yeah, it's fine. I mean, like, it's just sort of, I don't know how exciting it is, because we just pick an item and then explore, like, okay, if we choose, are we choosing a niche item, like heavy duty boots. No, are we? You know what I mean, though. You pick the item, and then it's like, okay, it uses this item well. Does it use any other items well? Cool, great. It's fine.
What if we get it wrong? What if we try to make a good choice band user that uses boots or scarf? Is that a concept failure?
I think so.
Yeah.
I guess my thing is like, I don't know if that's a concept failure because like I don't know, you know, Voodoo is famous that it was designed to work really well with Togekiss and then that's working really well with Zapdos, you know?
Yeah.
Way back in Gen 4, I've never played that meta, so I don't really know. And my understanding is like current Gen 4, you know, cap as much as it exists, Voodoo is just bad.
Yeah.
But like, you get what I mean? Like,
I think this concept is going to be one of those that's going to be really hard to gauge success with, like, in the sense that it's like you have to pick your item and then you have to try it with every other item, and if there's even one item that's better, then this is a failure. You know what I mean?
I mean, frankly for me, I think it just sort of, it fails the flashiness test unless we choose a niche item. And if we do choose a niche item, it's very difficult to do. Like, you know, a jetpack, you know, one of the items people love, you know. But what if it ends up wanting to run boots?
What if it runs room service?
Or, you know, what if it ends up running specs? Or what if it ends up running leftovers, you know?
Yeah.
Is that a failure? I think a lot of people would argue yes. So, like, I think there's a strong incentive to choose just a generally good proven item. And I think that makes the concept a lot less interesting.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay.
I don't have really much to say about this concept, to be honest, anymore.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Apex Predator, Pseudo Trapper. Okay, this one's not done, so we'll just probably skip it because, like, they literally just copy and pasted the explanation questions and justification. So we will just move on from that. Snake post comments. Woo. Okay, Star Falcon 5555. A blessing from the heavens. This Pokemon is designed to be the perfect user of the move Revival Blessing. I mean, you know, it's really easy to gauge how successful this would be. I just think that it's sort of like, Ciz, we'll get to your concept a little bit. I think this is very much just like picking a cool thing that came around in Gen 9. It's like, can we do this, but better? And like, presently, I don't know if it would really make it that interesting of a process because there are two different Revival Blessing Mons, and like, Revival Blessing's been really underwhelming in its actual eventual applications, and it just seems very like, to me.
I think it's also that, like, every time, I guess this is going to LMs, but like every time the Revival Blessing ends up being good, people hate it.
Yeah.
You know, people hate it. And that's just my thing, is just like every time, the evidence we have is that every time a Revival Blessing ends up being a good move within the meta, people just sort of try to ban it.
Yeah. It's like, I feel like this opens the same door that having a electric terrain setter in this case. You know what I mean? Like, an electric terrain setter is sort of the same thing that this concept wants to present. Because it's like opening up a Pandora's box. If you make a really good Revival Blessing Mon, then suddenly you're making it so that you're creating a lot of space where things can go wrong. That's kind of my thought.
Yeah. I think this is also like, currently like, Balmont and Rapska.
Yeah, Rapska.
Or
Whatever, yeah.
kind of like, I mean, Balmont has kind of been fringe viable at some point.
Yeah.
Rapska is kind of just bad, but at that point we're like actually just doing this but better. And I'm not sure if that is something that we want to do. And I guess this is also kind of my concept, sort of. But what I'm trying to say here is, what does this bring to the meta that Palmot cannot?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, my thing is just like, if we do this well, people will argue for it to be nerfed.
Yes.
That, just frankly, he's doing this well practically. Is we made a Harvest Leatherberry Revival user that fits well on stall. You know, that's for me like the optimal outcome for this. And I don't want to face him on that uses Revival Pressing 10 times a game to make a stall team unkillable. You know?
Agreed.
No.
Or like,
I think
yeah.
I think also, like, if you really wanted to use Revival Blessing, you can just slap a Scarf Pomade on your team, and it will rock, probably.
Yeah, definitely.
Like, again, fundamentally, we're working with a move that is very, very low momentum. And I just sort of I just don't know if this is a box we want to open.
Yeah, I'm of that exact opinion.
Sorry, let's...
Yeah. Why don't we move along here? Place the scene, uses of Primordial Sea or Desolate Land. That is illegal, so we will skip it. Critical Receiver, a Pokemon that is designed to react positively to being critted instead of playing around crits. Why don't we briefly talk about this one? Because, frankly, beyond Anger Point, I don't see why we would use this.
It is a 1 in 24 chance to occur.
I believe
Turn.
Canaan's
And-
fan. Yeah, I believe Canaan's fan is kind of under the assumption that custom elements are okay and we do double battle.
Yeah.
Looking at their questions.
Yeah. Because, like, in a double battle, how would this Pokemon react to allies being critical hit? Unfortunately, we don't build for doubles, we make for singles, and, like, other than Anger Point, why would we want to be critted? Like, I just can't think of a reason we would want to be critted unless we were, like, Focus Sash Reversal. Yeah. It just, yeah. Unfortunately, I think the concept has the right motivations, but it's coming from a wrong perspective.
Okay, Derek, time.
Yep. Alright, Turn Killer. This cap specializes in exploiting a specific move or set of moves opponents may choose. This Pokemon's playstyle is centralized around doing so, creating many switch opportunities for itself on the basis that the opponent is selecting the targeted moves. I think it's like a metagame specific thing. You can sort of, if you can predict what your opponent's bringing, this could be really good. I do think this is going to be something that if we make a cap with this concept, it will advance the metagame to create, like, more novel sets, because it's sort of preying on, like, easy mode copy-paste sets, if that makes sense.
I think this covers a lot of the same design spaces, Creative Parasite and,
Yeah.
Parry and
I forget
Riposte.
the other one. Yeah. And I think it really just does sort of alter the, like, not recency bias, but like first come first serve kind of bias of, like, you know, these are very similar concepts. I think they ask very similar questions of us, and I'm just still biased towards the one I saw first. I think it's a good example. I think this would be a fun concept to do. I think there's a lot of really nice options that we could cover, but I've sort of said what I want to earlier. You know.
Yep.
It's good. I'd vote for it. I just don't know. I just don't think that Asma would end up slating more than one of this, like, genre.
Yep, I agree.
I agree too. This is pretty much what I wanted to say.
Okay, great. Sizz, your turn. New Toy Syndrome. This Pokemon effectively makes use of a signature move or ability newly introduced in the current generation. You want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, I've kind of been lazy. I haven't written the explanation yet. But basically, the concept is we pick a move or ability introduced in Gen 9 and then build them on around that. And this doesn't have to be a new signature move or ability. I don't think. That's why it's in brackets. But like there's currently like 4 possible outcomes when it comes to the new moves and abilities. One is like in Gambit, basically. It's used in OU and is pretty good. 2, this move or ability is banned or stuck on something that is banned,
Mm-hmm.
3, this move or ability is on a mon that is unviable. Or 4, this move is on something in OU, but it's just not used, basically. I think Gen 9 has brought a lot of interesting new abilities and moves to the table that previously were just not available, and I think I think we could build something around one of these new elements that might shape OU to be a little bit more like varied, I guess.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good one. I would love to see a way that we could use something like Rage Fist in a constructive way that doesn't just make something immediately broken, that's not also just Primeape. I think it would also be interesting to see stuff like... That's another good one that I really like. Like another user of Salt Cure, maybe, or like seeing like what that might look like under different circumstances. There's a lot of different things to look through. I think it's...
These are...
Oh, go ahead.
These are always good concepts, you know. It's always good to just like choose a move and just build around it. I think it almost always works out well, just because you get so much direction from that move choice early on, and it really just helps you inform the rest of the process. And you know, Roger wasn't, you know, it has its issues, but it was a nice process. You know, Libra again had its issues, famously, but you know, great end product just because you get so much direction from the move choice. The only thing I really do have to say is that the move or ability choice is the difficult part, because I think structuring the process such that you sort of have them on equal footing would be difficult unless you make the choice move or ability during concept assessment and then optionally run a second concept assessment. So that's my one thing. It's just like you'd have to pick which of the two you're going to look at.
I think, yeah, maybe I should put this in more explicitly, but I think the idea is to only use one new move or ability to build around, and then if something else happens, it happens.
Yeah, I would definitely say, like, maybe make it clear one. Make use of one signature move or ability.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. I think that would be a great way to sort of say, we are only doing this, we are exploring this new thing that was introduced. Okay. Sephi took my name. Unexplored potential. This Pokemon takes advantage of obscure, overlooked, seemingly redundant exhibiting of an existing ability, effect, or mechanic in a way that sets it apart from others that use the mechanic. This is cool, kinda. Like, I just... you'd have to be very specific about what it is you want to explore in the first place. Like, it's very broad. This one's very broad starting right now. And so, it's just a matter of figuring out how that broadness can be narrowed down.
I think this is kind of the antithesis to my concept, though.
Yeah, I think so. It's like, look at everything else that has existed. Let's try to do it better. Compared to yours, like, look at this new thing. Let's see if we can do it better. Yeah.
In terms of like, I don't want to compare them too much. However, I do think this is indeed very broad, and it might be tough to make a choice on what we want to do here.
Yeah, it's tough
I think
to know.
this is one of those where we'd have to have very strong concept assessments, but at the same time, I'm a sucker for subtle interactions, and this is basically screaming at us to like do some kind of subtle interaction, you know?
Yeah.
So,
but it goes back to that idea of subtlety, where Cap is not always the best at subtlety.
Yeah, at the same time, like, there's enough routes forward, and I have faith that someone would come into concept assessment with like a really compelling idea and sort of like push us down that path.
Yeah, I think so too. Unless you have any other thoughts, we can move on.
Not really.
Okay. Burn your boats. This Pokemon effectively uses the move No Retreat to make progress in battle. I think it's a little too condensed, because, like, no retreat essentially, you know, boosts all your stats, but you can't switch out. So, like, I think the only way you would want to be able to use it is either you get an extra boost, perhaps with, like, simple, or you are a ghost type. Or you Terra Ghost. But then you
I think this would be better if we focus more on, like, the expanded a bit to include, like, I don't know if there's any other legal right now, but, like, Victory Dance. You know, like, the moves that boost Victory Dance and Quiver Dance, the moves that just boost a lot of stats at once.
Yeah.
You know, because a ghost type with no retreat, I think, is pretty much the logical outcome here.
Yeah.
And I don't find that nearly as interesting.
Yeah.
It's just like, if we expanded a bit and just allowed for, like, Quiver Dance, Victory Dance, I wish that, like, what was Komaro's
Clangorous Soul.
Yeah. You know, like...
But that's a Z move.
No.
it's the...
Oh, sorry, no, I'm thinking of the other one.
33's.
We've been going for 2.5 hours almost. I'm losing. But yeah, no, go for it.
Ideally, the outcome we go for is not a ghost type here, because that is just chickening out, basically. I think the idea is actually just to actually make use of no retreat, whether we want to or not. Basically, you click it and you're stuck.
Yeah, so there's got to be more, like, there's got to be a good reason to use it.
I mean, the thing is with Terra, you will just Terra Ghost it, you know?
Yeah.
Perhaps, yeah. I don't think you can Terra and switch in the same turn.
Yeah, but if you Terra Ghost, you can use no retreat again.
I guess.
Yeah, I just feel like there's not much interesting things to, like, just do with this, because it's like, okay, it becomes Terra Ghost, no retreat, now it's good-ish, you can switch out, that's it. It just doesn't feel very deep.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Next.
Yep. A Rising Star. This Pokemon uses a strategy or toolset that was not viable in previous OU generations. This is basically, like, barely slightly more condensed version of, like, the one where we look at all the lower tier ones of all the generations and do that. I think it's exactly...
And that's just, like, it's asking us to... Oh, it's something that's usable now-ish?
Yeah,
only recently viable tools is the thing that makes it different, I think.
Yeah. I think it's just different enough. But it's really similar.
The focus on stuff that is viable now is the big difference.
Yes.
You know, like...
Oh, yeah, that is a good point, actually. Sorry, I misunderstood that. Yeah, that, like, something that's viable now that wasn't before. Why has that changed? Okay. That's actually a much more interesting thing. If we can point out what those are, that would be a really interesting concept, actually.
I'm admittedly having a bit of trouble thinking of them, because Encore is, like, the big one.
I think, like, Guts Boosted Facade stuff, you know?
But, like, we had a Conch last gen.
Yeah, that's true.
These things haven't actually changed, though. Just the circumstance of the metagame right now.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be a big question, just like, what counts as recently viable? I think there is potentially no... Yeah, the recently viable is the hard part for me, because, like...
Are there any Pokemon that weren't OU before that are OU now?
And use a new tool.
Yeah. Or did they just get better out of, like, circumstance?
Like, I think Sun is a big one.
Yeah. Sun gets the...
Solia does this.
Yeah, Crush is a big one. I mean, stored power in general.
Yeah. Hard to go wrong.
I guess that's my thing with just, like... I think this could be sort of difficult in terms of the scope.
I agree.
I think the idea is kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
However, the options are extremely limited here.
I agree. I think it would be really cool to look at this, like, later up in the generation.
Yeah.
I would definitely see, like...
that's the same feedback I have for, like, the lower tier concept of just like,
Yep.
this would be really cool if it was like the last concept of a gen.
Yes, I agree. I think it's just that the metagame isn't quite stable now, so we don't have a good idea of what currently is still viable, you know? And it would be really cool to even see, like, a strategy that wasn't viable at the start of the gen that is now, you know? Like, that's also an idea. So, let's move on to One Hit Wonder. This Pokemon aimed to succeed with as limited of a move pool as humanly possible. That's cool, kinda. It makes it predictable, but also kind of fun. Like, not the worst concept, in my opinion.
I mean, the thing is, we can sort of just do that arbitrarily, you know?
I agree.
Because there's a lot of mons that only run 4 moves, you know? Like, as much as Great Tusk runs a lot of different moves, if it just had Headlong, CC, Knock, Spin, it would still be a viable mon.
Right.
Is that a valid outcome? Do we want a mon that, you know, only really has 3 good moves? You know?
If anything, I think this concept almost is like, this Pokemon has, in total, 4 moves. Like, I think the perfect execution of this concept would be like, the only moves it has are the ones it uses.
And then, like, Tackle. Yeah, just because we need to give it a level up.
Yeah.
I think Cap recently has been really struggling with limiting move pool.
Yes.
But on the other hand, I think it's really cool to just go on some type of Wobbuffet type beat
Yeah.
and just have 5 moves.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have 5
my-
moves. Pick all but one. This
guess
could
my-
be a cool concept. Honestly, it really
think it
could be.
is.
It's just like, I don't know how Cap would execute it.
I guess my main issue with it is also like my main issue with a lot of the concepts that are like fix something Cap does, you know, sort of with Hemogoblin also.
Yeah.
It's just, I feel like it doesn't give us much direction beyond this has a small move pool, and I think that could really cause the project to flounder in a lot of stages.
Yes.
Because like, beyond having 4 moves total, you know, that isn't the exact concept, but you get what I mean.
Yes.
What else do we have?
Nothing.
Yeah, and that's just sort of the issue for me. It's just like, where do we go from there? Is it an offensive beast? Is it a wall? Is it a pivot? Is it like, you know, like Rotom Wash in Gen 6 was an immensely strong one, but it had like 4 relevant moves.
Yeah. It's
I'm
like,
thinking 5.
it's never,
you know?
yeah. Like, the only move you would maybe play around with is Wisp. Or not even, it'd be like, what's that last
Split.
move? Is it Pain Split? Is it Volt, or is it Thunderbolt?
Is it?
Or is it like,
It's literally just, is it Pain Split or is it running a Scarf Trick set? You know?
yeah.
Like, that's sort of the issue for me. It's just like, you know, we can absolutely just give this only 4 moves, but we have nothing beyond that to sort of define them on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Bulky gravity user. This Pokemon can set up gravity as well as benefit from its effects. I think just based on like this design, it's illegal, or if it's not illegal, it's very close to being illegal. Because
Voltage, what if we made a poison ground type with an ability that made gravity last 5 turns instead of whatever?
oh my gosh, that might be like the thing I'm using in my hands that spins, you know?
Yeah, we've sort of already, like, we haven't done this, but like, this is absolutely something where, like, you know, gravity Lando, like, it's a very difficult concept because it sort of just implies very, very, very specific things about the mon.
Yeah.
And the fact that we have a lot of mons that could theoretically use it, you know, Equilibra, but don't, even when they have very limited move pools, you know, says a lot to me.
Yep, I agree.
I think you've pretty much captured what I think about this concept.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of this one. Feedback. Okay, Gabo Swampert's workaround. This Pokemon explores the importance of immunities by having its own to help on its role and find creative ways to counter the immunities of others. Being able to get through type immunities is cool, but I worry that it might get a little too, like, look at what we can do, but should we do this, you know?
Yeah, I think it could lead to a profoundly limited ability stage because for me, a lot of this is either like we have Mold Breaker, we have a type immunity, or like
Corrosion.
where do we really go from there?
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of like,
Yeah, it's a bit like I don't think there's too much design space here.
Yeah.
Pretty much, that's what my main gripe is here.
Yeah. I don't have too much more to say about this one at the moment. I think that's kind of how I feel about this other one. Between you and people in the call, like, I do have to do stuff at 6:30, and I haven't showered from going to the gym yet, so...
Yeah, let's just cover I think the next one's the last one on the page.
Yeah, bench warmer, and then... The Velours one's really good.
Let's just cover the.
Let's just cover bench warmer. Yep. Okay.
Velours is really a meta concept.
Okay.
You know.
Bench warmer. This Pokemon doesn't have to ever switch in to be a great teammate. What do you think about this one?
I think it covers basically the same design space as Create a Parasite.
It makes you like have to consistently observe its presence and appreciate it being just around in general. I think going back to that Heatran, Eruption Heatran with Balloon, like that is exactly what this concept is.
Or,
it's the threat of switching in.
Having a booster energy on Core Valiant in the back.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think I've been reading this concept wrong. I thought it was a meme. However,
Really?
I see the depth now. Yeah, this is actually kind of interesting. Though
I almost
I don't
like it
really-
more than Create a Parasite, despite having said like the entire process that like Create a Parasite was my favorite of this genre. I think, very explicitly asking, how do you exert a lot of pressure by the threat of switching in is a really cool idea.
Yeah.
this also kind of combines the Mage Killer one, I think. In the way that if this mon ever switches in, it will wreak havoc, and you do not want that.
Also, Rip Pursuit.
Yeah. This one would have been amazing if there were Pursuit. But I think it's a really cool concept, and like, I think it's being slept on a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's a really good concept. I think it is very much so up there for me. I think it's really interesting to ask the question of like, how do you exert the most implicit pressure possible?
Yeah. Without...
I think it's...
And does that pressure
fun.
translate to, is the pressure coming from it switching in? Or is it like what it does when it's off the field? Like, is this a threat when it's on the field, or is the idea of it coming in the scary part? You know what I mean?
And what does it actually do once it's in?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. Like, is it a threat when it's in, or is it a threat because it comes in?
I mean, I think Ditto's the biggest example of this,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Like,
Ditto and Quagsire.
There is so much that you just refuse to do because there's a Ditto.
This feels like that Canary in the Coal Mine archetype, where it's like Quagsire and Ditto being viable in a metagame means that the metagame is fundamentally unhealthy. Like, this feels
I
like
think-
that.
This also sort of goes back to Hazehawk, where there's so much you will just refuse to do because the Hazehawk exists, and you know for a fact that if the Hazehawk switches in on this turn exactly,
Yeah.
you have to switch out.
Agreed.
I think
Or
there's
you're-
something funny about designing a mon that is actually kind of just designed to not necessarily switch in, or ever Z-play, for that matter.
Yeah. That is kind of funny. I like that idea. I think this one's a good concept. I think, I hope that if it doesn't get slated, it gets resubmitted.
Yeah, to very quickly cover Balor's concept on the
Yes,
next page.
because we have just that one, and I'm not going to do Old Dog New Tricks. We've seen that one plenty of times.
That's the same as Balor's. No, read the description of Old Dog New Tricks.
This Pokemon is convergent. Oh, yeah, it's illegal. Never mind.
Yep. Okay, so this is a meta concept.
Yep. Good artist copy, great artist steal. A Pokemon that revisits old existing concepts, takes a more modern spin on them while going a completely different route than we did previously. Existing cap differently functioning while still being notably similar, though. Think convergent species-esque, but not actually just a convergent species.
So my absurdly hot take
Yeah.
for this concept is that it is far more interesting if we choose a recent cap.
Yeah, but then we also might fall into the same pitfalls. It's like, we might fall into... You remember when we did Astrolotl and what the idea of, like, what does offensive team support look like? And it came down to, like, what happens if we keep Explosion and Trick on Astro, but then instead we get rid of, like, all of its status moves, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of just of being like, you know, what if we chose Miasma and we just explicitly look to why Miasma sort of failed, you know, and can use that info. Because I think that info isn't really as accessible as if we chose, like,
Cyclone.
Yeah.
Or Voodoo.
Yeah, being able to, like, explicitly point it's like, hey, this is what we learned, this is where we made mistakes, this is where we can go forward. I think that's a lot more interesting.
Yeah, let's
With
just
that
remake
said-
all the starters.
Please.
Even just movability interactions, that would be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with this one, Q's. I think it's going to be the most effective if we choose something that is Gen 7 onward, when Cap really started to get modernized in its process.
But if we bring it up to a vote, we would choose something early gen because we've had the most time pass.
Yeah. I think
Well,
both are
actually,
very
we would
interesting
choose-
ideas.
We would choose Ormoth.
Yeah.
That is
very
what would
much-
happen.
I'm very much of the opinion that the success of this concept really actually just is defined by the concept we choose, and there are so many different possibilities to work with. That is
Yeah.
a little bit too broad for my liking, I think.
I think we'd probably have to need like 2 weeks to just discuss which concept we'd actually choose.
Yeah, we could just pick Oromoth's concept, now without Bug Maniac Bob in the way.
Yeah.
This is the Flash Cup.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
You would also have someone pop in to just say, yo, we should be able to choose flash caps too.
Oh, that would stink, but also be kind of cool.
Look, Focus Punch Abuser would be the optimal.
I want a defensive Protean user.
Yeah. Okay.
All right,
I
and
think
then there's
there's one
Gesture's
more,
Smokescreen, but I haven't read this one at all to like give it a good thing. Seeks to fake out a Pokemon player from understanding what the player's next move is through tactics that almost seem nonsensical. So it's the haha, I was only pretending to be stupid.
The second this exists, the tactics would no longer be nonsensical.
Right. Yeah. Feels very
That's just it.
backwards. I think this one needs a little bit more development because it was literally posted as we started this PodCAP. So I don't have a good analysis of it. But yeah, 2 hours and 40 minutes by the recording time. After we cut out some time, it's still going to be 2.5 hours of just talking concepts. So, yeah, I think that's everything.
Yeah, I'm gonna go rock on. Cecile.
Hooray! Yeah, so thanks again for tuning in. Thanks again to Q's and Scizivire for joining me today for this PodCAP. If you enjoyed this PodCAP, please leave a comment. Let me know. We might do more PodCAPs related to like how to get involved with CAP, like what are the roles that go into a process, what do we consider to be, you know, meaningful steps as we go through a process, what does it mean to TL, all these things. So just let me know what you want to know, if anything. Ideally, we make some more of these. But otherwise, yeah, that's kind of it. If you do want to get involved, you still can. Cap33 is just starting, so it's very exciting. Thanks again for tuning in, and until the next one, talk to you later.